Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey, my dear friends, it's so good to have you here again tonight. Make yourself cozy. Maybe tug that blanket up a little higher, because what I'm about to tell you sounds unbelievable, yet every bit of it truly happened. Imagine this. What if, right now, every light in your house went dark and never came back? No lamps, no phone glow, no tiny clock display. Not for an hour or a single night, but forever. For many of us, that thought feels mildly unsettling, maybe even a little thrilling for 10 minutes, then fear creeps in. But here's the truth. For folks living in Victorian England, that wasn't a horror story. That was just an ordinary evening. Tonight, we're traveling back to a time that looks lovely on the surface. Those beautiful homes, lace curtains, fine dishes. But after sunset, life inside became something most of us would hardly recognize. Honestly, something most of us couldn't survive for even a week. So let's paint the picture properly. Picture London. The year is 1875. It's late October. The sun begins to set around 4 in the afternoon. The sky shifts from pale grey to deep purple to something almost menacing. And suddenly the woe. RDL contracts. Not figuratively, truly contracts. Because when darkness fell in a Victorian house, the safe zone, the circle of light you could actually see and move within, was only about 3 feet wide. The radius of one candle flame. Think about that for a moment. Everything past those 3 feet became shadowy corners you couldn't see into, stairways vanishing into blackness, hallways stretching endlessly into the dark. This wasn't just annoying for the people living it. This was the everyday reality of every single evening from October through March. Now, I need to be honest with you about something, because I think we often idealize the Victorian era in a way that misses what it was truly like. We see the art, we see the portraits of families gathered around a warm hearth, everyone looking healthy and happy. We watch dramas where candles somehow light up an entire room perfectly. No one's eyes hurt. Everyone reads letters without squinting like they're deciphering ancient codes. But here's the truth. Those paintings hide. A cheap tallow candle, the kind most working-class Victorian families actually used, gave off about the same light as a modern 10-watt bulb. On a good day, tea. Allow candles also stank. They smelled of cooked animal fat, because that's exactly what they were made from. Try eating dinner by the romantic glow of boiled sheep fat. Even nicer beeswax candles, which cost much more, cast dim, uneven light. Shadows constantly danced on the walls. Every movement created shifting darkness around it. Historians who have recreated Victorian lighting call it deeply disorienting. Your eyes never truly settle, never truly rest. And here's what genuinely gets me every time I think about it. People read by this light. Kids did schoolwork. Seamstresses stitched for hours. Clerks copied documents. Writers wrote novels. Charles Dickens wrote beloved stories by candlelight, and his eyesight got very bad by his mid-40s. That's no accident. There's a particular document I find fascinating, a household guide from 1861 by a woman named Isabella Beeton, who became something like the Victorian Martha Stewart. In her book, she laid out the exact schedule of a well-run home. And when you read the evening sections closely, you notice something. Everything was organized around the limits of light. Dinner was served early, ideally before natural light faded. Guests were expected to come and leave before full darkness. Children were sent to bed, not mainly because of a set time, but because keeping them awake meant burning more candles, and candles cost money. In the 1860s, a working-class London family might spend about 8 to 12% of their weekly income on candles and lamp oil alone. That's not small. That's a real sacrifice. That's the choice between candles or better meat for Sunday dinner. And for the very poor, the families in cramped East London tenements that Charles Booth documented in the late 1880s, darkness wasn't just inconvenient. It was total. Many families couldn't afford any candles after the first half of the month. They went to bed when it got dark, period. Now, here's where it gets interesting and truly overlooked. The way people experience time itself shifted because of this. Without electric light, the human body followed something much closer to its natural rhythm. Researchers who study historical sleep patterns, including historian Roger Ekirch, whose work on pre-industrial sleep changed how I think about this completely, have found strong evidence that Victorians, and people before them, didn't sleep like we do. T. Hay slept in 2 separate chunks. They called it first sleep, starting around sunset. A person might sleep for 3 or 4 hours, then wake naturally around midnight. And here's the wild part: that waking wasn't seen as a problem. It wasn't insomnia. It was just how night worked. People would lie quietly, pray, think, sometimes get up briefly. Some couples used this time to talk. Some wrote in their journals. Then after an hour or so, they'd drift into what was called second sleep until dawn. The pressure to sleep 8 straight hours, that anxiety so many of us feel today, is actually a product of artificial light and the Industrial Revolution. The moment factories required workers to be awake and alert at set times, and the moment gaslight and then electric light made it possible to stay up all night, our bond with nighttime began to break in ways we're still trying to understand. There's something quietly sad about that. In trying to defeat the dark, we may have lost something we never knew we possessed. But let's not get too philosophical yet, because the more you look at how Victorian families actually spent those long, dark evenings, the more layers you find. And some of those, the layers are truly surprising. The middle-class Victorian family, for instance, had oil lamps, a big step up from candles. A good argand lamp, which used a hollow circular wick that drew air from the center to create a brighter, steadier flame, could produce light about equal to a modern 30-watt bulb. That sounds okay until you remember that one 30-watt bulb doesn't do much for a room with 40-foot ceilings. And these lamps had their own demands. They needed to be filled with whale oil or later kerosene. They needed trimming, meaning the wick had to be cut and adjusted precisely every single evening, or the flame would smoke and flicker and give off more black soot than actual light. Tending the lamps was a daily chore, usually falling to servants in wealthier homes and to the wife or oldest daughter in homes without help. The upkeep, the expense, the smell, the fire risk. All of it was a constant negotiation that we simply do not think about anymore. When I sit here and type in a bright room at 10 at night without a single thought about it, that ease is the result of something truly revolutionary. It's just that the revolution happened so long ago that we've forgotten there was ever a time before it, and that very forgetting is exactly why the Victorian night is so worth understanding. Because the moment the sun went down in an 1875 house, a whole parallel world came alive, a world shaped by shadows, ruled by fire, and filled with rituals, perils, and habits that have completely vanished from our modern lives. The lighting was just the start, because behind those dim windows, people lived lives of extraordinary complexity. There were dangers that crept in with the dark that had nothing to do with monsters. There were technologies that promised to chase away the shadows and ended up being quietly, almost poetically deadly. And that's exactly what we'll uncover next. Because the story of how Victorians tried to light their homes is, in many ways, a story about the risky bargains people make when they're desperate for just a little more light. So we left off with a promise, the idea that Victorians made a dangerous bargain when they reached for more light, and there's no better example of that bargain than the gas lamp. If you had walked into a well-off Victorian home sometime in the 1850s or 1860s and seen the gas lights burning in the parlor, you would have had, I have been genuinely impressed. Compared to the dim, smoky flicker of a tallow candle, gaslight was amazing. It was brighter, steadier, and felt so modern that people felt real pride. Having gaslight in your home wasn't just convenient, it was a status symbol. It meant you were keeping up with the times. It meant you were civilized. What the brochures didn't mention was that it was also slowly, quietly filling your home with poison. Let me take you back to London in the 1850s, when gaslight was spreading rapidly through middle and upper-class homes. The system worked by burning coal gas, a mix of gases produced by heating coal in large municipal gasworks, piped directly into homes through underground pipes. Small burners on walls or ceilings were lit each evening with a match or taper, and they hissed softly as they burned. And that hissing sound, that was the first clue that something wasn't quite right. Coal gas contains hydrogen cyanide, ammonia, carbon monoxide, and benzene, among other things. None of those words are good to hear when we're talking about something burning inside your bedroom. But in the 1850s, the chemistry wasn't fully understood, and even among those who did understand, there was a cultural tendency to downplay the risks. Progress had a way of doing that, making people overlook dangers because the benefits were so visible and the dangers were invisible. The carbon monoxide problem was especially sneaky. This gas is colorless, completely odorless, and in lower amounts it doesn't kill you right away. Instead, it causes headaches, tiredness, a foggy, heavy-headed feeling that Victorian doctors often called nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia, a catch-all term for almost any vague, hard-to-explain illness. Families would report always feeling tired in the evenings, sleeping heavily but waking unrefreshed, children seeming listless and pale during winter. Physicians would recommend rest, fresh air, maybe a tonic. No one connected it to the soft blue flames burning in every room. Does that make you feel just a little uneasy? Because it should. These were smart, educated people in the most advanced city in the world at the time, and they were being quietly poisoned in their own living rooms without any clue it was happening. Beyond the chemical dangers, there was another problem with gaslight that was much more dramatic. It burned. not metaphor. Collie, not occasionally. Victorian homes with gaslight caught fire alarmingly often, and the records from London's fire brigades in the second half of the 19th century make for truly sobering reading. A loose fitting, a crack in a pipe, a burner left on by mistake, any of these could fill a room with gas, and all it took was one spark to turn an elegant Victorian parlour into something very different indeed. The fashion of the era made this catastrophically worse. Victorian women wore enormous skirts. The crinoline style, supported by a cage of steel hoops, could extend 3 or 4 feet from the body in every direction. When a woman leaned too close to a wall-mounted gas burner to reach something on a shelf or moved too fast past a fireplace, the fabric could catch with terrifying speed. Crinoline fires were so common in the 1850s and 1860s that they had their own category in death statistics. The Illustrated London News, a popular magazine of the time, ran so many stories about crinoline fire accidents that social reformers began campaigning against the fashion purely for safety. A person named Archibald Sinclair, actually, a man, despite the name, published a pamphlet in 1858, estimated adding that crinolines caused a significant number of female fire deaths in British homes each year. And here's what strikes me most about this. Gaslight was the aspirational choice. It was what people saved for, what they pointed to with pride. The danger didn't stop people from wanting it. If anything, the prestige of having it seemed to outweigh the risk. That pattern where we accept hidden costs because the visible benefits are so appealing feels very familiar even today, doesn't it? But let me tell you about something even more unexpected. Because the quality of gaslight itself had a strange effect on people that goes beyond physical hazards. Gaslight casts a particular kind of glow. It burns with a yellowish, slightly greenish hue and creates deep, dramatic shadows. Unlike modern lighting, which tends to flatten and even out a room, gaslight creates contrast bright pockets and dark corners existing together in the same space. Interior designers and historians who have recreated authentic Victorian gaslit environments consistently describe the effect as truly disorienting at first. Your eyes work much harder in gaslight than in electric light. The constant tiny adjustments your pupils make tracking movement and shifting between brightness and shadow are actually measurable in studies of historical lighting. What this meant practically is that Victorian evenings at home were physically tiring in a way we simply don't experience anymore. Reading by gaslight was demanding on the eyes in a different way than reading by candlelight. It was brighter, yes, but the flickering and the color of the flame still caused significant strain. Opticians in the Victorian era reported a steady rise in patients complaining of eye fatigue and worsening near vision. And the medical literature of the period is full of recommendations about proper positioning relative to gas lamps, the importance of not reading for too long, the danger of letting children study too close to a burner. They were essentially writing instructions for how to live with something that wasn't entirely safe and treating those instructions as a reasonable solution, which again feels strangely familiar. There's a particular case that I think captures the strange duality of Victorian gaslight better than almost anything else. In 1868, a young woman named Elizabeth Siddal, though by then she'd been married, died to the painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti, died in her home on Chatham Place in London. The official cause was an overdose of laudanum, but the circumstances of her final hours included a gas lamp that had been left burning in her bedroom overnight. Her husband returned home to find the room thick with fumes. Whether the gas contributed to what happened that night or simply added a further layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation, we can't say for sure. But the image of the lamp burning softly, steadily in the dark while someone lay dying in its glow, strikes me as a kind of terrible metaphor for the whole Victorian relationship with gaslight. Beautiful, dangerous, and somehow so normal that no one thought to question it until it was too late. Gaslight began its slow fade from Victorian homes in the 1880s as electric lighting started becoming practical for domestic use. Thomas Edison's practical incandescent bulb was demonstrated in 1879, and by the late 1880s, a handful of wealthy London homes had begun the switch. The Savoy Theatre became the first public building in the world to be lit entirely by electricity in 1881, when audiences walked in and saw those steady, clear, and white lights. No flickering, no smell, no hissing. The reaction was reportedly one of genuine amazement. Some people were suspicious. Surely something that bright and steady must be less safe, not more. It took years for cultural trust in electric light to solidify. And isn't that a funny thing when you think about it? The thing that was actually safe took longer to be trusted than the thing that had been quietly dangerous all along. It makes you wonder how many times in history and, honestly, in our own lives we've extended trust to the familiar at the expense of the truly better option. Just because we know the risks doesn't always mean we act on them. The gas lamp, though, was only one piece of the puzzle, because while the parlors and drawing rooms were navigating the hazards of open flame, something else entirely was happening on the other side of the house, below the grand staircases, behind the green baize doors, in the parts of these homes that most guests never saw. The servants' world after dark was its own universe. And once you understand what was happening down there every single night, you'll never look at a Victorian house the same way again. There's a door in almost every grand Victorian home that most visitors never noticed, or if they did, they were quietly expected to pretend they hadn't. It was usually covered in green baize fabric, that distinctive dark felt material, and it separated the front of the house from the back, the family's world from the servants' world, the polished mahogany and oil paintings from the stone floors and coal dust. Cross that threshold, and you stepped into a completely different England, one that kept the whole elegant operation running and asked almost nothing in return except your labor, your silence, and most of your waking hours. After dark, that hidden world came fully alive. To understand what evenings below stairs were really like, you first have to grasp the sheer scale of domestic service in Victorian England. By 1891, the national census recorded over 1.3 million people employed as domestic servants in England and Wales alone. That made domestic service the single largest employment category in the country, larger than coal mining, larger than textiles, larger than farming. 1 in 3 working women in Victorian England was a domestic servant. Let that number sit for a moment. 1 in 3. Here are not people on the margins of Victorian society. They were the invisible infrastructure of it. And nowhere was their invisibility more complete or more deliberate than in the evening hours, when the family retired and the real work of keeping a Victorian household functioning began. The hierarchy below stairs was rigid in a way that almost defies modern imagination. At the top sat the butler, who managed the male staff, the wine cellar, and the front door, and who carried himself with a gravity that often rivaled the master of the house. Below him, the housekeeper, almost always a middle-aged woman, addressed formally as Mrs. regardless of whether she had ever been married, because the title was simply a mark of her authority. Then the cook, who ruled the kitchen like a small sovereign state and answered to almost no one, and cascading downward from there. The lady's maid, the footman, the housemaids, the kitchen maids, the scullery maid at the very bottom, who was often a girl of 13 or 14 working from before dawn until 10 or 11 at night for wages that wouldn't cover a week's groceries by today's standards. Each of these people had an evening routine, and those routines were every bit as structured and exhausting as the daytime ones. After the family left the dining room for after-dinner conversation in the drawing room, the housemaids moved through the dining room like a quiet tide, clearing, resetting, polishing. Then upstairs to turn down the beds, warm the sheets with a long-handled bed warmer, filled with hot coals, set out the nightclothes, fill the wash basins, check the chamber pots. Every bedroom in the house prepared before the family retired, and all of this had to be done with almost no sound and with a specific kind of invisibility. The rules in many households were explicit. A housemaid caught in the family's part of the house at the wrong time was expected to turn and face the wall until the family member had passed, not to make eye contact, not to speak unless spoken to essentially disappear in plain sight. Mrs. Beeton's Guide, the same household manual from 1861, actually codified these expectations in writing. The message it conveyed to servants was clear. You exist to enable this household, not to be seen within it. I find that genuinely difficult to sit with. These were human beings, often young women barely out of childhood, making themselves invisible as a professional requirement, night after night. But here's where the story gets more layered and more human than the formal rules suggest. Because once the family was in bed and the green baize door was closed for the night, something shifted below stairs. The kitchen, warm from the range that burned almost continuously, became a gathering place. Servants who'd been scattered through the house all day, never allowed to speak above a murmur in the family's presence, finally came together in the only hours that were even remotely their own. The cook might brew a pot of tea. The footman might sit at the long kitchen table. Conversation, real conversation, uncensored and unsupervised, filled the room. Eric Horn, a butler who worked in grand English houses for over 40 years and wrote a remarkable memoir in 1923, described these evening hours in the kitchen as the only time servants felt fully human during their working lives. He wrote about the laughter, the gossip, the card games, the occasional bottle of something that had been quietly appropriated from the cellar. The kitchen at night was a world unto itself, warmer, louder, and infinitely more. I am alive than the hushed formality of the rooms above. And of course, within that world, romances developed. Friendships formed that lasted lifetimes. Rivalries simmered. Hierarchies that were invisible to the family above were enforced with considerable intensity below the footman and the kitchen maid, who were discovered in a compromising situation, the housekeeper who kept a ledger of every minor infraction to deploy at the next hiring reference, the cook who had worked for the same family for 23 years and considered the kitchen more her domain than anyone else's. It was, in the most complete sense, a parallel society operating within the walls of a single building. The physical conditions of this parallel society deserve attention too, because they stand in stark contrast to the comfort being maintained upstairs. Servants' bedrooms, typically in the attic or the basement, were almost universally unheated. The family's rooms had fireplaces maintained by the servants. The servants' own rooms did not. In winter, temperatures in London attic rooms could drop to near freezing on cold nights, and the housemaids who had spent the evening warming other people's sheets with coal bed warmers climbed into their own cold beds with no such comfort waiting for them. A survey of servants' conditions conducted in the 1890s found that the average housemaid in a middle-class London household, slept in a room measuring approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, often shared with 1 or 2 other women, with a single small window, no heating and furnishings, that consisted of an iron bedstead, a washstand, and if she was fortunate, a small chest for her belongings. The contrast with the rooms she spent her evenings preparing the deep mattresses, the warmed linen, the fires banked just so was not lost on the servants themselves. Eric Horn in his memoir noted it with a dry understatement that I think speaks volumes. He wrote that a good servant learned early not to compare her situation with those she served, because the comparison did not improve either the situation or the mood. That kind of quiet endurance, the discipline of not looking sideways at what you don't have, is something I find both deeply moving and a little heartbreaking. These were people who made Victorian domestic life possible, who made it look effortless and beautiful from the outside, and who went to bed in the cold dark at the end of it. And then they were up again at 5:30 in the morning, the scullery maid first to light the kitchen range, then the housemaids moving through the house in the grey pre-dawn, laying the fires in the family rooms so that everything would be warm before anyone of consequence was awake to notice the effort it had taken. The whole machine restarting in the dark, invisibly, so that when the family descended at 8 o'clock to a warm house and a late breakfast, it simply seemed like the natural state of things. That invisibility, that seamless, effortful, unacknowledged performance, is one of the things that makes the servants' world so compelling to think about. They were the secret engine of Victorian domesticity, and the secret was kept so well that most of the families they served gave it very little thought at all. Which brings me to something that I think connects all of this to the broader story of the Victorian night in a way that's worth sitting with. The darkness that fell over a Victorian home every evening wasn't experienced equally by everyone inside it. For the family, nightfall meant retreat, comfort, the rituals of rest. For the servants, it meant a second shift, a different kind of darkness colder, more physical, and lit only by the fires they had built for someone else. And speaking of darkness, the kind that crept into the bedrooms of Victorian homes, that's exactly where our story is heading next. Because the Victorian bedroom itself was a place of genuine documented danger. The things that lived in those mattresses, crawled along those skirting boards, and drifted through that unventilated air were not the stuff of ghost stories. They were something considerably more real and considerably more unpleasant. Right then, we've made it through the parlor, past the green baize door, and now it's time to go somewhere even more personal, the bedroom. And I want you to pause for just a second before we step inside, because I think most of us carry a particular image of a Victorian bedroom in our heads. Heavy curtains in deep burgundy or forest green, a carved wooden bed frame with a thick mattress piled high with linen, maybe a dressing table with a mirror, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a fire glowing softly in the grate. It looks, in our imagination, like the most comfortable place in the world. Here is what that image left. Ave's out, the smell. The cold that crept in from the walls no matter how well the fire was laid. The things living inside that gorgeous mattress that you absolutely did not want to think about in the dark. And the very real, very documented fear shared by physicians, clergymen, and ordinary families alike that going to sleep might, under the wrong circumstances, be something you didn't come back from. The Victorian bedroom wasn't a sanctuary. It was, in the most honest sense of the word, a battleground. Let's start with the cold, because it shaped everything else about how Victorians slept, and it's the detail that tends to genuinely shock people when they first encounter it. Central heating, as we understand it today, did not exist in Victorian domestic life. A few experimental steam heating systems appeared in very grand houses toward the end of the century. But for the overwhelming majority of Victorian families, including quite prosperous ones, the only source of heat in a bedroom was a fireplace. And fireplaces, as any historian of domestic life will tell you, are spectacular at heating the 6 feet of space directly in front of them and essentially useless for everything else. The corners of a Victorian bedroom in January could be genuinely measurably freezing. A well-documented study of thermal conditions in period buildings found that in unheated corners of rooms with a single open fireplace, temperatures on cold nights could drop to between 34 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. The water in the wash basin on your dressing table would develop a thin skin of ice by morning. People who lived through Victorian winters in ordinary homes described breaking the ice in their wash basins as a mundane morning ritual, the way we might describe making coffee. Getting undressed in that environment required a particular kind of determination that I honestly think we've completely lost. Victorian nightwear was not the flimsy cotton of modern pajamas. It was heavy flannel, full length, often including a nightcap to retain body heat, because the head loses a disproportionate amount of warmth, and the Victorians knew it intuitively, even if they didn't have the science to explain why. Bed socks were not optional, they were survival equipment. The bed itself was the only warm place in the room, and the process of getting into it warming the sheets first with that coal-filled bed warmer the housemaid had prepared, then getting in as quickly as possible, and pulling the curtains of the four-poster closed to create a tent of trapped body heat was a nightly performance that had been refined over generations. Heavy bed curtains weren't decorative, they were insulation. Without them, the radiant cold from the walls would pull heat away from the sleeping body all night long. Now, about what was living in that warm curtain bed alongside you. I'll be gentle about this, but I also won't soften it too much, because the reality is part of the story. Bedbugs and, I mean this in the most literal etymological sense, were one of the defining domestic problems of the Victorian era. Not just in poor households, not just in overcrowded urban tenements, but in respectable middle-class, well-managed Victorian homes. The insects travelled in second-hand furniture, in luggage, in the stuffing of mattresses, and once established in a household, they were extraordinarily difficult to eliminate with the tools available at the time. The standard Victorian mattress was filled with horsehair, wool, flock, or straw. All of these materials provided ideal harbourage. For insects, and the warmth of a sleeping body made the mattress the most attractive location in the house. Pest control manuals from the 1860s and 1870s, and there were several, because the market for them was substantial recommended treatments, including oil of turpentine, spirits of wine, and a compound of corrosive sublimate, which is mercuric chloride, a highly toxic substance that was essentially being brushed onto surfaces where people slept. The fact that these treatments were themselves dangerous seems not to have been the primary concern. The bugs were worse. One guide published in 1869 aimed specifically at housewives managing their own households, estimated that a single untreated infested mattress could harbor several thousand insects at various life stages. The author wrote this with a calm, practical tone that suggests the reader was not expected to be shocked, merely instructed. This was a known, managed problem, not a crisis, just life. Does that change how you picture that lovely Victorian bedroom? Because it changes it quite a bit for me. Beyond the cold and the insect sand, I realize that sentence is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, was a third element of the Victorian bedroom that deserves its own moment. The air itself. Victorian medical theory was still substantially shaped by the concept of miasma, the idea inherited from ancient medicine and still dominant in the early to mid-19th century. That disease was caused by bad air, specifically by the kind of warm, stagnant, organic-smelling air that accumulated in enclosed spaces where people slept. The miasma theory was wrong in its mechanism. We now know that most infectious diseases are caused by pathogens, not by smells, but it wasn't entirely wrong in its instincts. Poorly ventilated rooms where multiple people slept did carry higher concentrations of exhaled carbon dioxide, higher humidity, and in some cases genuinely elevated pathogen loads from respiratory illness. The Victorians were right that something was wrong with the air in a sealed bedroom. They just didn't know exactly what. The response to this was a genuinely fascinating split in Victorian medical and domestic advice. On one hand, physicians and sanitary reformers from the 1850s onward campaigned vigorously for open windows at night. Edwin Chadwick, whose 1842 report on the sanitary conditions of the laboring population was one of the most influential public health documents of the century, argued that fresh air was among the most powerful tools against disease. Wealthy Victorian homes began to incorporate purpose-built ventilation systems, small grilles above windows, ventilated chimney flues, even mechanical air pumps in some avant-garde designs. On the other hand, the same families who were being told to open their windows were also being told by different authorities that night air was specifically dangerous, that the air after dark carried particular hazards, fogs, effluvia from the ground, mysterious emanations that daylight somehow neutralized. This belief was widespread enough that many Victorians slept in tightly sealed rooms with the windows firmly shut and heavy curtains drawn, convinced that the outside night air was the enemy. The result, in practice, was often a room that was simultaneously freezing cold and stubbornly unventilated, sealed against the dangerous outdoors, but offering its occupants a choice between fresh cold air and stale warm air, with no obvious good option. Florence Nightingale, who had rather strong opinions about almost everything related to sanitation and health, addressed this directly in her 1860 book on nursing. She was withering about the common Victorian habit of sealing bedrooms at night, writing that the only air worth breathing was air that had been in contact with vegetation, and that a tightly closed bedroom was among the most reliable ways to make a sick person sicker. Given that Nightingale had spent years nursing soldiers in conditions far worse than any Victorian bedroom, her frustration with middle-class squeamishness about open windows feels entirely earned. There's a specific detail that I keep coming back to when I think about all of this, and it's this. The people who slept in these rooms were not naive or careless. They were doing their best with what they understood, in conditions that we would find nearly intolerable. The woman who sealed her bedroom window against the night air because she genuinely feared it was protecting her family as best she knew how. The father who spent money he could barely spare on mercuric chloride treatment for the mattress was trying to give his children a safer night's sleep. The family who huddled under layers of flannel and wool in a curtained bed in January was adapting intelligently. To a cold they had no other way to manage. When I read the diaries and household manuals and medical guides from this period, and there are a remarkable number of them, what strikes me most is not the strangeness of the Victorian bedroom. It's the familiarity of the underlying effort, the attempt to make the night safe, the negotiation between what you know and what you fear and what you can actually afford to do about it. That effort, in some form or another, is as human as anything we do. And it connects quite naturally to what came next in the Victorian evening routine, because once the bedroom was as prepared as it could be, once the fire was laid and the bed was warmed, and the windows were either open or firmly shut, depending on whose advice you were following, that particular week there was still one more thing that had to happen before a Victorian family could sleep. The rituals, the prayers, the small ceremonies and habits, and occasionally the substances they consumed to make sure that sleep actually came. Some of those rituals were touching, some were genuinely dangerous, and at least one of them was something that, if it happened today, would result in a very serious convergence. Station with the doctor. Picture this for a moment. It's 9 o'clock on a winter evening in 1872. The fire in the bedroom has been burning for an hour, and the room is finally approaching something resembling warm. The housemaid has turned down the bed and slipped away without a sound. The candle on the nightstand is casting that familiar, unsteady light across the walls. And now, before anyone in this household lies down to sleep, there is a whole sequence of things that must happen first. Not because they feel like it, not because it's a pleasant routine they've chosen for themselves, but because these rituals, some of them ancient, some of them very new, some of them frankly alarming by any modern standard, are woven so deeply into the fabric of Victorian domestic life that skipping them would feel not just strange, but genuinely dangerous. What happened in those quiet minutes between sitting up and lying down tells us more about how Victorians understood the world and their place in it than almost anything else in their daily lives. Let's begin with prayer, because it was the ritual that cut across every class, every income level, every type of Victorian household, and it meant something different in each of them. Family prayers in the Victorian home were not a casual, optional affair. For most of the 19th century, they were a daily obligation held in the morning, yes, but also in many households repeated in the evening before bed. The entire household would gather, father, mother, children, and in households that could afford it, the servants as well, filing in from below stairs in their uniforms, standing at the back of the room or kneeling on the drawing room floor while the head of the house read from scripture. The practice was so embedded in Victorian middle-class life that household management guides devoted entire chapters to it: the timing, the appropriate passages, the correct posture. Isabella Beeton, whose 1861 guide shaped so many Victorian domestic routines, described the evening gathering of the household for prayers as a foundational pillar of a well-ordered home, not just spiritually, but morally and socially. The idea was that a household that prayed together acknowledged a shared set of obligations, a shared vulnerability before something larger than any of them. What I find genuinely moving about this when I sit with it is the Durlying honesty. The Victorians went to bed every night, knowing things that we've managed in our modern comfort to mostly forget. They knew that illness came quickly and without warning. They knew that children died at rates we can barely comprehend today, with roughly 1 in 5 children in Victorian England not surviving to their 5th birthday. They knew that the night held real dangers. Prayer in that context wasn't superstition. It was a completely rational response to genuine uncertainty. The act of committing yourself and the people you loved into the care of something beyond your own control before closing your eyes in the dark, that makes a different kind of sense when you understand what the dark actually contained. But prayer was only the beginning, because alongside the spiritual rituals ran a parallel set of practices that were considerably more chemical in nature. Here is where the story takes a turn that I think will genuinely stop you in your tracks. If you were a Victorian parent in the 1860s or 1870s and your child was struggling to settle for the night, crying, restless, refusing to sleep, there was a product you could buy at any pharmacy, advertised openly. In newspapers and women's magazines with cheerful illustrations of sleeping infants on the packaging, that promised to solve your problem quickly and reliably. It was called a soothing syrup, and the most famous Miss Winslow's soothing syrup, which was marketed specifically for teething infants and children who would not sleep, contained a carefully measured dose of morphine sulfate, approximately 65 milligrams per fluid ounce, along with a significant quantity of alcohol. To be absolutely clear about what that means, Victorian parents were giving their babies morphine to make them sleep, and they were doing it not furtively, not guiltily, not in secret, but following the directions on the label, after reading the advertisements in the newspaper, after asking the pharmacist who recommended it by name. The product sold in enormous quantities throughout the United States and Britain for decades. It was available until well into the 20th century. And the reason it sold so well, the reason mothers and fathers trusted it, was that it worked. The baby stopped crying. The baby slept. The exhausted parent could finally rest. The fact that morphine administered repeatedly to an infant caused NCY caused respiratory suppression, and in cases of accidental overdose caused death. These consequences were either not understood, not publicized, or not considered sufficiently important to outweigh the product's obvious usefulness. When I read the advertisements for Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, and they're genuinely easy to find in archived Victorian newspapers, what strikes me is the language. Warm, reassuring, almost affectionate. Give your little one rest, trusted by mothers everywhere. The gap between that language and what the product actually contained is one of those historical moments where you have to sit quietly for a moment before you can continue. Mrs. Winslow's was the most famous, but it was far from alone. Godfrey's cordial and other widely used children's preparations contained laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol, and was sold specifically for infants. Dalby's carminative, advertised for wind and colic in babies, also contained opium derivatives. A parliamentary inquiry in the 1870s estimated that in certain English industrial towns, where mothers worked long factory shifts and needed their children managed overnight, the use of opium-based infant PR. Separations were so widespread that it was simply considered a normal part of childcare. The inquiry found cases of infants who had been dosed nightly from the first. Weeks of life, children who were described by neighbors as unusually quiet and pale. The language used in the parliamentary record is careful, measured, bureaucratic. But reading between the lines, the picture it paints is one of ordinary people making impossible choices under impossible conditions with the tools that were available to them. I don't say this to cast judgment on Victorian parents. Most of them had no idea what was in these products beyond the cheerful label. The science of pharmacology was young. Regulation was almost non-existent, and the concept of addiction, as we understand it today, was barely articulated in mainstream medicine. What they knew was exhaustion, and what they had was a bottle that helped. That context matters. History always makes more sense when you understand the pressure people were actually under. Beyond the chemical aids to sleep, The Victorian bedtime ritual included a whole ecosystem of superstitions and folk practices that ran alongside official Christianity with surprising comfort. T-dot shoes, for instance. The practice of placing shoes with the toes, pointing away from the bed, or in some regional variations, turning one shoe upside down before sleeping was documented across multiple counties of England throughout the Victorian period. The belief, loosely, was that it confused malevolent spirits that might otherwise find their way to the sleeper. The logic isn't entirely clear, but the practice was consistent enough across different communities that folklorists of the period noted it repeatedly. Mirrors were another source of genuine nocturnal anxiety. The Victorian superstition around covered mirrors, particularly in rooms where illness had occurred or where someone was believed to have recently passed away, was connected to a broader set of beliefs about the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. At night, that boundary felt thinner. Mirrors, which seemed to show a world adjacent to but separate from the real one, were regarded with specific unease after dark. John Brand, whose collection of popular antiquities went through multiple Victorian editions and documented folk customs across England, recorded dozens of bedtime superstitions that were actively practiced in Victorian households. These weren't just the habits of the rural poor or the uneducated. They were practiced in city houses, in the homes of tradespeople and minor professionals, quietly alongside the evening Bible reading and the family prayers, as if two entirely different systems of belief could occupy the same bedroom without contradiction. And honestly, I think they could. I think most of us, if we're being truthful about our 2 a.m. moments, understand that logic and fear don't always operate in the same room at the same time. The Victorian who knelt for prayers and then turned her shoes around before getting into bed wasn't being irrational. She was covering all available ground, which is a very human thing to do when the candle is the only light in the room and the night is long. There was one more element of the Victorian bedtime ritual that I want to linger on, because it speaks to something that has almost entirely disappeared from our modern nights: the act of writing. Diary keeping in the Victorian era was practiced at a rate that modern researchers find almost startling. Not just by the famous, not just by the literary or the political, why significant, but by ordinary Victorian men and women who sat at their writing desks in the last hour before bed and recorded the day's events in leather-bound journals. The practice was actively encouraged by conduct books, by religious advisors, by the broader cultural sense that a life examined was a life better lived. What these diaries contain collectively is a record of how the Victorian night felt from the inside. The fears articulated in careful copperplate handwriting, the small rituals described matter-of-factly, the prayers recorded sometimes verbatim, the worry about a child's cough that appeared in entry after entry until it either resolved or didn't. Reading Victorian diaries, and thousands of them have been digitized and made available to researchers, is one of the most direct ways to understand that these people were not figures in a period drama. They were people lying awake in the dark, writing down their anxieties by candlelight, hoping the morning would be better than the evening had been. That impulse to make sense of the day before surrendering it to sleep hasn't changed at all. Only the medium has. All of these rituals, when you gather them together, were doing give the same essential thing. They were building a wall between the conscious, managed world of the day and the uncontrolled, vulnerable hours of the night. Prayer for the soul, morphine syrup for the body, shoes turned the wrong way for whatever might be listening in the dark. A diary entry to process what the mind couldn't yet release. The Victorian bedtime ritual was, at its core, a negotiation with vulnerability, an acknowledgement that sleep required a kind of surrender, and that surrender needed to be managed carefully. And what waited on the other side of that surrender was sometimes a great deal darker than a bad dream. Because Victorian medicine had its own relationship with the night, its own tools, its own remedies, its own ideas about what happened to the human body in the hours of darkness. And some of those ideas and some of those treatments were so far removed from anything resembling modern care that they deserve their own conversation entirely. What I'm about to tell you requires a small amount of trust, because when you first hear some of this, your instinct is going to be that I've gotten something wrong. That surely no qualified medical professional in any IRA would have recommended this. That someone must have raised an objection. That common sense alone would have intervened. But common sense, it turns out, is deeply shaped by the knowledge available to it. And Victorian medicine, earnest, ambitious, frequently brilliant in its aspirations, and genuinely terrifying in some of its methods, operated in a world where the germ theory of disease was still being argued over, where the mechanisms of the human body were only partially understood, and where the night itself was considered a medically distinct environment with its own specific dangers and its own specific cures. What Victorian doctors did to their patients after dark is one of the strangest chapters in the history of medicine, and it begins, of all places, with the humble act of bleeding someone while they slept. Bloodletting, the practice of deliberately opening a vein to remove what physicians believed was excess or corrupted blood, was not, as many people assume, a medieval relic that had faded by the Victorian era. It was still being practiced in the early decades of the 19th century with genuine professional confidence, and its evening and nighttime applications were considered, dared particularly important. The logic, such as it was, went like this. The body was believed to be more receptive to treatment during sleep, when it was at rest and not expending energy on the activities of the day. Evening bloodletting, performed as part of the preparation for sleep, was thought to calm the system, reduce inflammatory fevers, and prepare the patient for the restorative work the body supposedly performed during the night hours. Physicians who practiced it spoke about it with the same measured authority that a modern doctor might use to discuss adjusting a medication dosage. Benjamin Rush, the American physician who was one of the most influential medical voices of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a man whose work shaped generations of Victorian-era practitioners on both sides of the Atlantic, was a passionate advocate for aggressive bloodletting. He reportedly removed up to 4/5 of a patient's blood volume during particularly severe illness, operating on the theory that almost any condition could be improved by removing enough of the corrupted fluid. His patients died at rates that, even by the standards of his own era, prompted concern among some colleagues. The practice began declining seriously in mainstream medicine by the 1850s and 1860s, as statistical analysis, the kind being pioneered by figures like Pierre Louis in Paris, who actually counted outcomes rather than relying on anecdote, began to make it embarrassingly clear that bled patients did not get better faster. They often got considerably worse. But here's the uncomfortable detail that tends to get lost when we tell this story as a simple tale of progress replacing ignorance. The decline was slow, uneven, contested. As late as the 1870s, there were respectable Victorian physicians still recommending modified forms of bloodletting for specific conditions. The transition from a world where bleeding was medicine to a world where it was obviously harmful took longer than we like to think. And in that gap, real people were being treated with real harm, in good faith, by people who genuinely believed they were helping. But bloodletting was at least on its way out by the height of the Victorian era. What replaced it in many cases was something that presented itself as more modern, more scientific, and more precisely calibrated to the chemistry of the human body. It was also, in ways that took decades to fully understand, profoundly dangerous in its own right. Chloral hydrate was synthesized in 1832, but it entered widespread medical use as a sedative in the 1860s, and its arrival was greeted with something close to euphoria in certain medical circles. Here, finally, was a substance that could reliably produce sleep, not the uncertain drowsiness of a glass of wine or the crude, blunt force of opium, but a measured, predictable, chemically precise sedation. Physicians could give a patient chloral hydrate and reasonably expect sleep to follow within 30 minutes. For the management of insomnia, of nervous conditions, of pain that prevented rest, of the general Victorian category of hysteria, which was applied to women experiencing almost any kind of emotional distress, chloral hydrate was prescribed with remarkable frequency and remarkable liberality. A physician writing in the Lancet Medical Journal in 1869 described it as among the most valuable additions to the pharmacopoeia in decades. Patients who had struggled for years with sleepless nights were finally getting rest. What the enthusiasm of the 1860s didn't fully account for was that chloral hydrate was also highly addictive. The effective dose and the harmful dose were uncomfortably close together, and that patients who took it regularly quickly developed a tolerance that required progressively larger amounts to achieve the same effect. The writer Wilkie Collins, who was one of the most popular novelists of the Victorian era, best known today for works like The Woman in White and The Moonstone, became dependent on laudanum, and later on chloral hydrate, to manage the pain of what was likely severe gout. He described his experience with chloral in letters to friends in terms that read, with modern eyes, unmistakably as the language of dependency. He knew what was happening to him. He continued regardless, because the alternative, the nights without sleep, the pain without management, was something he couldn't face. Collins died in 1889. His doctor in the final years of his life was reportedly concerned about the quantities he was consuming, but felt unable to withdraw the treatment entirely without causing acute suffering. That bind the choice between two types of harm is something Victorian physicians encountered constantly, and it's something that humanizes them considerably, even when their solutions look alarming in retrospect. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough in histories of Victorian medicine, partly because it sounds almost too strange to be true, and partly because it requires us to confront a particular kind of Victorian medical thinking that is deeply uncomfortable by modern standards. The treatment of women's nighttime nervous conditions in the Victorian era is a chapter of medical history that has been extensively documented by feminist historians. And what it reveals is a system that had, in some cases, effectively medicalized the ordinary emotional responses of women under considerable social pressure. The diagnosis of hysteria derived from the Greek word for uterus, which tells you something about how the condition was conceptualized, was applied to a genuinely bewildering range of symptoms. Anxiety, sadness, irritability, insomnia, the inability to cope with domestic demands, emotional outbursts. In the language of Victorian medicine, all of these were understood as manifestations of a specifically female pathology rooted in the reproductive system, and they were treated accordingly. The nighttime dimension of this is particularly significant. Women who reported difficulty sleeping, who lay awake with racing thoughts or unspecified dread, who woke repeatedly during the night in states of anxiety, were in many cases prescribed bromide salts, potassium bromide, or sodium bromide as a nightly sedative. Bromide preparations were widely used from the 1850s onward, and like chloral hydrate, they worked. They did produce sedation. They also, with prolonged use, caused a collection of symptoms known as bromism, including cognitive impairment, skin conditions, depression, and in severe cases, psychosis. The women who took bromides every night for years on their doctor's advice, who became slower and duller and less themselves over time, who were then described in medical notes as showing the characteristic mental deterioration associated with their hysterical constitution, these women were, in a very real sense, experiencing the effects of their treatment rather than their original condition. And the treatment was causing the deterioration that was then used to justify continued treatment. I find this genuinely difficult to read about without feeling something. Not just intellectually, it lands somewhere more personal than that. Because these were not women who were poorly cared for. They were women whose doctors took their complaints seriously, investigated them thoroughly, and prescribed medication consistently. The failure was not of attention or of intention. It was a framework, a system of understanding that was wrong in its foundations and couldn't see its own errors because the errors were built into its vocabulary. There's a counterpoint worth raising here, because the Victorian medical relationship with the night also produced some remarkable insights that were genuinely ahead of their time. James Young Simpson, the Scottish physician who pioneered the use of chloroform as an anesthetic in surgery in the 1840s, was motivated in part by the suffering he witnessed in nighttime medical procedures operations performed without effective pain relief on patients who were fully conscious. His work, which was controversial precisely because some opponents argued that pain was a natural and perhaps morally necessary part of the healing process, ultimately transformed surgery into something survivable for the patient in a way it simply hadn't been before. The connection to night is this. Simpson's innovation changed what evening surgery meant. Before anesthesia, surgical procedures performed after dark in emergency situations, in difficult births, in the management of severe injuries were done on screaming, terrified patients held down by assistants. After chloroform became accepted, they were done on patients who were, for the duration, simply elsewhere. The moral weight of that shift, from a patient's perspective, is almost impossible to overstate. Simpson himself was a man of enormous warmth and considerable humor, by all accounts a physician who visited patients at all hours, who delivered babies in the middle of the night with the same energy he brought to his laboratory work, who genuinely seemed to find the suffering of others intolerable in a way that drove his entire career. He represents something important about Victorian medicine. The coexistence within the same era and sometimes the same individuals of practices that now look like harm and discoveries that were genuinely, lastingly good. Sitting with all of this, the bloodletting on its way out, the chloral hydrate on its way in, the bromides, the morphine syrups, the anesthesia, the fumbling toward G. RM. Theory. What strikes me most is how much of Victorian medical nighttime practice was motivated by a single, simple desire to make the suffering stop. The tools were often wrong. The theories were sometimes dangerously misguided. But the impulse behind almost all of it was recognizable and fundamentally decent. The parent giving the soothing syrup, the physician prescribing the bromide. The surgeon reaching for the chloroform, they were all, in their different ways, trying to do the same thing we try to do now. To reduce the pain, to bring rest, to get through the night in one piece. We have better tools. We understand more. But the night still brings its own particular quality of vulnerability, its own specific fears, its own category of suffering that daylight somehow manages to keep at a comfortable distance. And in Victorian England, once the doctor had visited, and the medicine had been taken, and the prayers had been said, and the candle had been blown out, what happened next in the streets beyond those darkened windows was a world entirely unto itself, a world that ran on darkness deliberately, that relied on the fact that respectable people had gone to bed, that had its own ecosystem, onomy, its own dangers, and its own cast of characters who only emerged once the city's surface had gone quiet. What was happening outside those Victorian walls after midnight is a story that most history books treat as a footnote. It deserves considerably more than that. Step outside for a moment. Not literally stay comfortable, stay warm, but in your imagination, step through the front door of that Victorian townhouse we've been exploring all evening and stand on the pavement outside. It's 11 at night.
The year is 1878. The street is not silent. This is the part that surprises people most when they first encounter it.
We carry an image of Victorian streets after dark as essentially empty, dangerous, perhaps foggy, certainly, but largely still the city sleeping, the respectable world gone to bed. But the reality, documented in extraordinary detail by the journalists and social investigators of the era, was something else entirely. Victorian London after midnight was not a city that had gone to sleep. It was a city that had changed shifts. And the workers who clocked on when the gaslights began to dim powered an economy that the daylight world depended on absolutely, while Mackie, NG every effort never to be seen by it. The most comprehensive portrait of this hidden nocturnal London was painted by a journalist named Henry Mayhew, whose monumental work, published across the early 1850s, documented the lives of London's working poor in a level of detail that had simply never been attempted before. Mayhew walked the streets at night. He sat in the coffee stalls. He interviewed the workers at 4 a.m. on the riverbank and the market porters arriving at Covent Garden before dawn. What he found was a civilization operating in the hours that polite society had vacated. Take Covent Garden Market, which in the Victorian era was London's central wholesale market for fruit, vegetables, and flowers. The market did not open at a genteel hour in the morning. The serious business began around 2 a.m, when the wagons started arriving from the farms and market gardens surrounding the city, the horses' hooves loud on the cobblestones in a way that would have been impossible to miss if the residential streets nearby hadn't been so thoroughly asleep. By 3, the market was in full operation. By 5, the retail traders had made their purchases and were loading their barrows. By 7, when the respectable household's cook stepped out to do her morning shopping, the entire nocturnal infrastructure that had made that shopping possible had already packed up and gone home. Mayhew estimated that several thousand people were involved in the supply and distribution chain that fed London's daily food markets, and that the overwhelming majority of their working hours fell between midnight and sunrise. They were, in the most literal sense, invisible to the people they fed. Then there were the night soil men. This is, I'll warn you gently, the least glamorous part of our story, but it's also one of the most important, because it illustrates something essential about how Victorian cities actually functioned, and about the extraordinary labor that was required to maintain even the most basic conditions of urban life. Before the sewage reforms of the 1860s transformed London's underground infrastructure, the city's human waste was collected by hand at night, by teams of workers known as night soil men. They worked between midnight and 4 a.m, moving through the streets with their carts and their tools, entering the private spaces of sleeping households to empty the cesspits that lay beneath them. The work was physically brutal, and the social stigma was absolute. Night soil men occupied the very bottom of London's occupational hierarchy, so far below the servants we discussed earlier that the two groups might as well have been living in different cities. And yet the work they did was, by any rational measure, among the most essential labor in the entire urban economy. Without it, the city would have choked on itself within weeks. There's something that I keep thinking about when I read accounts of the night soil men's work, and it's this. The city's health literally depended on people who were required, as a condition of their employment, to operate only in the hours when they couldn't be seen. The arrangement wasn't incidental. It was designed. Respectable Victorians wanted the benefit of the service without the discomfort of its visibility, and so an entire workforce was built around the principle of nocturnal invisibility. You could argue that this was simply practical nobody wants to see that work happening on their street in the middle of the afternoon. But you could also argue, and I think more honestly, that it reflects something about how Victorian society managed the distance between its ideals and its realities. What you couldn't see before breakfast couldn't trouble your conscience at dinner. Not all of London's night economy was invisible in the same way, though. Some of it was visible in a manner that Victorian society found deeply uncomfortable for entirely different reasons. The street life of areas like the Strand, Piccadilly, and the areas surrounding the major theatres and music halls was, in the hours between the end of evening entertainment and midnight, extraordinarily busy. The coffee stall operators set up their makeshift counters on street corners, dispensing hot drinks and food to anyone willing to stand in the cold and pay a halfpenny. The cab drivers congregated at their stands, their horses stamping and blowing in the chill air. Street musicians played for the crowds emerging from the theaters. Hot potato sellers pushed their wheeled ovens through the press of people. Henry Mayhew described the scene outside the Haymarket Theatre on a busy evening with the eye of a novelist. The noise, the density of people, the layers of social interaction happening simultaneously across different economic registers, wealthy theatregoers emerging in their evening clothes, working men stopping at the coffee stall for something hot before the long walk home, street children darting through the crowd looking for opportunities. It was, he wrote, like a city compressed into a single street corner, every class present simultaneously. The social distances of daylight temporarily collapsed by darkness and proximity. The Metropolitan Police, established by Robert Peel in 1829, had been specifically designed with London's night streets in mind. Peel understood that effective policing required a visible, organized presence in the hours when criminal activity peaked, and his reforms created the first professional civilian police force in the modern world, partly as a response to what unpolicied Victorian streets looked like after dark. Officers walked fixed beats through the night, their footsteps on the cobblestones becoming a familiar rhythm to anyone who lived along their routes. But policing had its limits, and the limits were geographic as much as anything else. Move east from the Haymarket past the city into the warren of streets in Whitechapel and Stepney A. 9th Bethnal Green, and the night economy took on a different character entirely. These were the districts that Charles Booth, the social researcher whose monumental survey of London life was published between 1886 and 1903, classified in the darkest shades of his famous poverty map, the areas where casual labor was the only work available, where families shared single rooms, where the infrastructure of Victorian civic life simply didn't reach. In these streets, the night was a different proposition. The gaslight was sparser, the police presence thinner, the social institutions of the respectable city largely absent. What filled that absence was a street economy that operated on its own rules, at its own hours, with its own particular mixture of ordinary survival and genuine danger. The women who worked these streets after darkened there were, by various contemporary estimates, tens of thousands of them in London alone by the 1880s, represented one of the most studied and most argued over subjects in Victorian social reform literature. The social reformer William Acton, whose 1857 work on the subject was both controversial and extensively read, tried to put precise numbers to the fino. Menon, and found himself defeated by the sheer scale of what he was attempting to measure. He concluded conservatively that the number was far larger than polite society preferred to acknowledge. What made the night streets of the East End particularly significant in the Victorian cultural imagination was what happened there in the autumn of 1888. The murders attributed to the figure known as Jack the Ripper, which took place over a period of roughly 10 weeks in the Whitechapel district, all at night, all in the streets and yards of the area Booth had coloured darkest on his poverty map. The murders, horrible as they were, did something that decades of social reform literature had failed to do. They forced the entire reading public of Britain and much of the world to look directly at what the Victorian night in these streets actually contained. The newspaper coverage was unprecedented in its detail. Readers who had never set foot east of the city found themselves confronted with the geography of nighttime poverty that their city had carefully kept at a comfortable distance. The journalist W.T. Stead, writing in the aftermath of the murders, argued that the horror wasn't simply the
Islands. It was the revelation that within a mile or two of the Bank of England, within easy walking distance of the theatres and the clubs and the shops of the West End, there existed a nocturnal world that had been allowed to develop in the dark, because nobody with the power to change it had been willing to look at it directly. That observation has stayed with me, because it points to something about the Victorian night that goes beyond the particulars of any single story. The way that darkness, literal and metaphorical, was used to manage what a society didn't want to confront about itself. The night soil men who worked only while others slept.
the street workers who disappeared from the narrative of respectable Victorian life as thoroughly as the servants behind the green baize door. And yet, for all the difficulty and the danger, there was also something in the Victorian night street that the daylight hours didn't offer. A kind of freedom that came specifically from the loosening of daytime rules, daytime hierarchies, daytime surveillance. The coffee stall on the corner at 1 in the morning was a democratic institution in a way that the tea-room in the afternoon would. As not. The man buying his halfpenny cup of coffee might be a night porter from a nearby hotel, or a clerk who'd been working late, or a cab driver between fares. Nobody asked.
Nobody much cared. The darkness leveled certain things, even as it amplified others.
Mayhew wrote about the coffee stall operators themselves with a warmth that comes through even across the distance of 170 years. Many of them were women widows, often, or women supporting families without a husband who had turned a modest investment in a copper boiler and a folding table into a reliable, if modest, livelihood. They knew their regulars.
They extended credit when they could.
They were, in their small way, the warm centers of a world that could be very cold indeed. There's something in that image, the light of the coffee stall, the warmth of the cup, the brief human exchange in the middle of the night that I find genuinely moving. Even in the darkest and most difficult corners of Victorian nocturnal life, people were finding ways to make something that felt, for a moment, like comfort. But there was another kind of comfort that the Victorians sought after dark, one that had nothing to do with hot coffee or warm bed. One that reached towards something they couldn't quite name, something on the other side of the visible world, in the space between the living and the dead. Because while the streets outside ran their secret economy, inside the parlors and drawing rooms of respectable Victorian homes, something extraordinary was happening. Tables were being lifted by invisible hands. Spirits were spelling out messages in the dark. And some of the most educated, most rational people in the most scientifically advanced society in the world were sitting around those tables, completely convinced that what they were experiencing was real. Close your eyes for just a second and imagine the scene. A drawing room in a prosperous London home sometime in the early 1870s. The curtains are drawn against the night. The gas lamps have been turned down low, deliberately, until the room sits in a warm, uncertain half-darkness. Around a circular table, 8 people are seated, their hands placed flat on the polished surface, fingertips touching. Nobody is speaking. The only sound is the soft tick of the mantel clock and, from somewhere outside, the distant clatter of a late carriage on the street. Then the table Ovies.
Not violently, not dramatically, a slow, deliberate tilt, first one way, then correcting as if something beneath it were finding its balance.
And then a series of raps from the surface itself, clear and distinct in a pattern that the group's designated interpreter begins with a trembling voice to decode. Someone is trying to communicate from the other side. Now, before you smile, before you file this away under quaint Victorian superstition, I want to tell you who is sitting at that table. Because the people who attended seances in Victorian England weren't primarily the credulous or the desperate or the uneducated. They were, in many cases, the most intellectually distinguished figures of the age. And understanding why they were there in that dimly lit room, reaching across the table toward the dead, tells us something profound about what the Victorian night really meant and what people were using it to do. The modern spiritualist movement, the organized, widespread, culturally significant version of it, began not in England, but in a small house in Hydesville, New York, in March of 1848. 2 sisters, Margaret and Kate Fox, reported hearing mysterious rapping sounds in their bedroom at night, and developed a system of communication with whatever was producing them. The story spread with extraordinary speed, first through American newspapers, then across the Atlantic, and within a few years, seances were being held in drawing rooms from Boston to Berlin to Birmingham. The timing was not accidental. The 1840s and 1850s were decades of profound disruption to the traditional structures of religious certainty in the English-speaking world. The publication of Charles Darwin's work on evolution in 1859, combined with decades of geological and archaeological discoveries that were quietly dismantling the literal biblical timeline, had created an atmosphere of spiritual anxiety among educated people that was real and widespread and not easily resolved. Here was the dilemma that faced a thoughtful, scientifically literate Victorian believer. The evidence for a purely material universe was accumulating. The evidence for the soul's survival after death was, by scientific standards, essentially non-existent. And yet the need to believe that the people you loved, the children who had died, the parents who were gone, the friends lost too young had not simply ceased to exist. ST was not a weakness or a foolishness. It was a deeply human requirement. Spiritualism presented itself as the solution, not as a rejection of science, but as its extension. The argument made by the movement's most articulate advocates was that the phenomena of the seance room, the rapping, the table movement, the messages, the materializations were not supernatural at all. They were natural phenomena that science had not yet explained, operating according to laws that investigation would eventually reveal. They were, in other words, proposing that you could apply the scientific method to the question of life after death, that you could test it, that you could know. For people who were desperate to know, that argument was almost irresistibly attractive. The Fox sisters became famous throughout the 1850s, touring extensively and giving demonstrations that drew enormous crowds. Margaret eventually confessed in 1888 that the rappings had been produced by manipulating her toe joints, a confession she later recanted, claiming she had been pressured into making it. The details of that particular story are genuinely complicated, and historians still argue about what exactly was happening in that original Hydesville bedroom. But by 1888, the confession didn't matter much anyway, because the movement the Fox sisters had helped ignite had developed an institutional life entirely independent of its origins. The Society for Psychical Research was founded in London in 1882. And this is the detail that I think most dramatically illustrates how seriously the Victorian intellectual establishment took these questions. Its founding members included the philosopher Henry Sidgwick, one of the most rigorous ethical thinkers in Victorian England. Its membership over the following decades included the physicist William Crookes, who discovered the element thallium and invented the cathode ray tube; the future Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, the classical scholar Frederick Myers, who coined the word telepathy; and later the creator of Sherlock Holmes himself, Arthur Conan Doyle, whose belief in spiritualism was so passionate and so public that it puzzled and saddened many of his admirers. What were these men doing in the Society for Psychical Research? They were investigating seriously, methodically, with controlled conditions and careful documentation. They sat in seance rooms not as credulous believers, but as trained observers, looking for fraud, testing mediums, trying to separate genuine unexplained phenomena from the very considerable human talent for deception and self-deception. Their results were mixed, their conclusions contested, and their methodology often criticized by later researchers. But the seriousness of the attempt is real. These were not gullible people. They were people in genuine intellectual difficulty, trying to apply the tools they had to a question they couldn't stop asking. The domestic séance, the kind held in private homes without professional mediums, among friends and family, was a different kind of experience from the public demonstrations, and it was, by all accounts, a predominantly nocturnal one. The darkness was considered essential, not just atmospherically, though it certainly helped, but theoretically. The prevailing spiritualist explanation was that the psychic force or actinic force postulated to explain the phenomena was sensitive to light and operated most freely in darkness or near darkness. This is, of course, also a remarkably convenient explanation for why fraud was harder to detect in dim conditions, but it aren't that the séance was definitionally a creature of the night, inextricable from the Victorian darkness we've been exploring all along. The table-turning sessions that swept through fashionable London society in the early 1850s were conducted in exactly the setting I described at the start. Drawn curtains, lowered lamps, hands on the table, waiting. The phenomenon spread so rapidly that in 1853 the scientist Michael Faraday, one of the genuine titans of Victorian science, the man who established the foundations of electromagnetic theory, felt compelled to investigate. He constructed a set of apparatus that could detect whether the table's movement was being caused by unconscious muscular pressure from the participants' hands rather than by any external force. His results were unambiguous. The movement was caused by the participants themselves, applying involuntary pressure without being aware they were doing it. He published his findings. He expected the table-turning craze to collapse. It didn't, because Faraday had answered the mechanical question but not the emotional one. The people around those tables weren't primarily seeking a physics demonstration. They were seeking connecti. Reassurance, the feeling even, if only for a moment, even in a half-dark room with their hands on a piece of furniture, that the people they had lost were somewhere reachable. Queen Victoria herself, which surprises many people when they first encounter it, was not indifferent to these currents. After the death of Prince Albert in 1861, a loss from which she never fully recovered, wearing mourning dress for the remaining 40 years of her life, Victoria became increasingly interested in attempts to communicate with the dead. She did not, as far as historical records show, attend formal séances. But she was surrounded by people who did her court, was not immune to spiritualist influences, and her relationship with her Highland servant, John Brown, which scandalized the court and the public alike, was by some accounts partly sustained by Brown's claimed ability to relay messages to her from Albert. Whether that particular story is true in its details hardly matters. What it illustrates is the reach of the spiritualist impulse, how far it penetrated, and how little social rank insulated people from the desire to maintain contact with those they had lost. Grief, it turns out, is a great L.
Evelyn.
Arthur Conan Doyle deserves his own moment here because his story is one of the most humanly interesting in the entire history of Victorian and Edwardian spiritualism. Doyle was trained as a physician. He was a precise thinker, a meticulous plotter, the creator of the most famous rationalist detective in literary history. And he spent the second half of his life in passionate, public, utterly convinced advocacy for spiritualism, attending seances, writing books, going on lecture tours, arguing with skeptics, and alienating people who felt that the creator of Sherlock Holmes had no business believing in things Sherlock Holmes would have demolished in 30 seconds. What drove him? Partly the deaths around him, his son Kingsley, who died in 1918 from influenza, complicated by wounds received in the war, was a loss from which Doyle never recovered. Partly a genuine philosophical conviction that science and spirit were not in opposition. But also, I think, something that he shared with the thousands of ordinary people sitting around drawing-room tables in the Victorian night. A refusal to accept that love simply ends, that the people who matter simply stop. The famous debunker H. R.E. Houdini, who was Doyle's friend for years before their friendship broke irreparably over these questions, said of Doyle that he was the most gullible man I've ever known. Doyle said of Houdini that he was a man of such extraordinary gifts that he must himself be a medium without knowing it. Both of them were, in their different ways, responding to the same question.
What happens in the dark? What is on the other side of the door that closes at the end? The difference was only in the answer they were willing to accept.
That question, and the domestic rituals the Victorians built around it, brings us to perhaps the most intimate and least examined dimension of Victorian nighttime life. Because while the séance was held in the drawing-room with its company and its ceremony, there was another kind of darkness that the Victorian woman of the house faced entirely alone, behind a locked door in the deepest privacy of her own life. And the story of what that darkness meant for Victorian women is one that the polished surface of Victorian domestic life worked very hard to keep invisible. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a house when everyone else has gone to bed.
Not the silence of peace, necessarily, not the silence of rest, but the silence of a woman sitting alone at her writing desk,
or lying awake in the dark with her eyes open, or standing at the bedroom window watching the street below, thinking thoughts that she would write down sometimes in a diary she kept hidden, thinking thoughts that had nowhere else to go. The Victorian home presented to the outside world as a sanctuary of warmth and order and domestic harmony, contained within it a private architecture of constraint that operated most completely after nightfall. And the person most shaped by that architecture, most defined by it, most confined by it, was the woman at its center. What I want to explore now is not the broad political story of Victorian women's rights, which is well documented and widely taught. What I want to explore is something more intimate than that. The specific texture of what it felt like to be a Victorian wife or mother in the private hours of the night. What the darkness of those evenings actually contained for her, and what it cost. Begin with the legal reality because it underpins everything else. Under the legal doctrine known as coverture, which relates to the relationship between a parent and child, remained substantially in force in England throughout most of the Victorian era. A married woman had no independent legal existence. Upon marriage, her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not keep her own earnings. Until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870 and its stronger successor in 1882. Whatever a woman owned before marriage became, at the moment of the ceremony, her husband's. What this meant in practice, and I want to be careful here to stay with the practical reality, rather than the abstract principle, was that the woman who managed the household, who kept the accounts, who supervised the servants and planned the meals and raised the children, did all of this without any legal claim to the house she managed, the money she handled, or, in cases of marital breakdown, the children she'd raised. She lived, in the eyes of the law, as a dependent within her own home. Now hold that thought and walk with me into the evening hours of that home, because the legal framework I've just described didn't disappear when the sun went down. It was most acutely felt there in the private spaces behind closed doors, in the hours when the performance of domestic harmony that the Victorian household presented to its visitors could finally be set aside. The Victorian wife's evening began with the end of dinner. Once the meal was finished, the ritual of the Victorian household required the women to withdraw, to leave the dining room to the men who had remained for port and conversation, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, while the women gathered in the drawing room to talk among themselves and wait. This custom so embedded in Victorian social practice that most participants regarded it as simply natural encoded something specific, that there were conversations the men needed to have without women present, and that the women's role was to make themselves available when required and absent when not. The women who wrote honestly about this in their private correspondence and diaries described the drawing room withdrawal with a range of tones, from cheerful acceptance to mild irritation to something considerably more raw. The writer and reformer Harriet Martineau, who moved in the highest intellectual circles of Victorian England and was too sharp-eyed to pretend she didn't know,
Order her to tell her what she was seeing, wrote in her autobiography about the experience of being the most intellectually accomplished person in a room and being structurally required to defer to men who were less capable simply because of the accident of sex. She wrote it without bitterness, which somehow makes it land harder. The bedroom, when the evening social rituals were concluded, was in most Victorian middle-class households a shared space, but one in which the terms of sharing were not negotiated equally. I want to approach this carefully, because it's a subject that touches on things that are genuinely private and genuinely painful. And I have no interest in sensationalism, but the historical record is clear enough that ignoring it would be dishonest. Until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1884, a husband in England could legally seek a court order to compel his wife to return to the matrimonial home if she left it an order enforceable by imprisonment. The law treated a wife's physical presence in the marital bedroom not as a matter of her own choice, but as an obligation she owed by contract. Women who sought refuge with relatives after leaving difficult marriages could be, and were forced, return. The reformer Caroline Norton, whose own marriage was spectacularly and publicly miserable, spent years campaigning to change these laws, drawing on her own experience of a husband who had legal custody of their children, despite being, by most accounts of the period, a cruel and negligent father. Her campaigns contributed to the Infant Custody Act of 1839 and various subsequent reforms. But Norton's case, which was followed avidly by the Victorian public and generated enormous empathy, also illustrates precisely how little protection the law offered to women in difficult marriages, and how completely the private space of the Victorian home was beyond the reach of any outside authority. What happened behind closed doors in the Victorian legal and social framework was the husband's domain. The diaries that Victorian women kept, and they kept them in remarkable numbers, are among the most valuable historical documents we have for understanding what those closed doors actually contained. Most of them were carefully self-censored. Victorian women knew that their diaries were not entirely private, that servants might read them, that curious husbands might look, that daughters might find them after their mothers were gone. The most painful material was often encoded, elliptical, written in a way that gestures toward experience without naming it. But sometimes the coding slips. Sometimes the exhaustion or the grief or the anger breaks through the careful copperplate, handwriting in ways that feel shockingly immediate across the century and a half that separates us. The scholar Patricia Jalland, who spent years studying Victorian death and family life, and whose work I find indispensable for understanding this period, analyzed hundreds of family letters and diaries, and found that the emotional labor of Victorian family life fell overwhelmingly on women. Not just the physical labor of household management, but the invisible work of managing everyone else's feelings, maintaining the emotional equilibrium of the home, being the reservoir of comfort and patience that everyone else drew from without anyone much thinking about whether it ever got replenished. The night was where the cost of that labor showed most clearly, because the night was the only time the performance could be suspended. The children were in bed, the servants were below stairs, the husband was asleep. And the woman who had been cheerful and capable and organized and emotionally available for 12 straight hours could finally, in the privacy of those dark hours, be whatever she actually was. Some of them were found genuinely contented, genuinely fulfilled, living lives they had chosen and found meaningful. Victorian women were not universally miserable. That would be its own kind of distortion. But the ones who were not fine, the ones for whom the performance was genuinely costly, had very limited options for what to do with that cost. They wrote it down.
They prayed. They lay awake. There's a particular medical category that I think illuminates the Victorian woman's night more clearly than almost anything else, and it's one that historians of medicine have returned to repeatedly precisely because it is so revealing. The diagnosis of nervous exhaustion, or neurasthenia, that convenient Victorian umbrella term we touched on briefly when discussing carbon monoxide, was applied to women at rates dramatically higher than to men. The American physician George Beard, who popularized the neurasthenia concept in the 1880s, argued that the modern age was simply too stimulating for the more delicate nervous systems of women, and that the appropriate treatment was rest complete, sustained, enforced rest away from all mental and social stimulation. The rest cure prescribed by the Philadelphia physician Silas Weir Mitchell took this logic to its extreme. Women diagnosed with nervous conditions were confined to bed, sometimes for weeks, forbidden from reading, writing, or receiving visitors. They were fed, turned, and managed by nurses, their every activity controlled until their physician decided they had recovered enough to resume their normal lives. The writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman underwent Mitchell's rest cure in 1887 and described the experience in terms that are still difficult to read. The enforced passivity, the prohibition on the intellectual activity that was her primary source of meaning, the creeping sense of dissolution that accompanied total removal of any agency over her own existence. Her famous story, The Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1892, drew directly on that experience and presented it as a form of psychological destruction dressed up as medical care. Mitchell reportedly read the story and modified his approach afterward. Whether the modification was substantial enough to matter is, historians suggest, debatable. What strikes me about the rest cure, and about neurasthenia as a diagnosis more broadly, is that it managed the symptoms while being structurally unable to address the cause. If a woman's nervous exhaustion was partly the product of years of invisible emotional labor, of legal powerlessness, of the gap between her inner life and the role she was required to perform, then putting her to bed for 6 weeks and sending her back to exactly the same conditions was never going to be more than a temporary reprieve. The night would come again, the performance would resume, and somewhere in the small hours, behind drawn curtains, the cost would go on accumulating. I don't want to leave this part of the story entirely in the dark, though, because the Victorian woman's night also contained something that I think deserves equal weight alongside everything else. It contained resistance. Quiet, creative, sometimes enormously courageous resistance. The hours after the household was asleep were, for many Victorian women, the only hours that were genuinely their own, and some of them used those hours with remarkable productivity. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote poetry at night in the rooms of Wimpole Street, where her father's control over the household extended to monitoring her activities by day. George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans, wrote some of the most penetrating novels in the English language in a social situation of considerable complexity, navigating the Victorian world's judgment of her unconventional domestic arrangements with a steadiness that comes through in everything she wrote. These women are the famous examples. But behind them, in ordinary Victorian households all over England, there were women who read books they weren't supposed to be reading, who wrote letters to friends about ideas that the drawing-room conversation didn't have room for, who conducted an entire intellectual and emotional life in the margins of the roles they were assigned quietly, persistently, in the only hours when the scrutiny of the household was suspended. That persistence matters. It's not a consolation for the constraints, but it's evidence of something that I think is genuinely important. That the Victorian woman's night, for all its difficulties, was also a space where a different kind of self could exist, where the gap between the performed self and the actual self could be, for a few hours at least, honestly inhabited. The candle burning late in the upstairs window, the pen moving across the page in the silence after midnight, the book open under the bedclothes, small acts of self-preservation that accumulated over decades and across thousands of women added up to something that slowly, imperfectly, and at great cost, began to change the world they lived in. The darkness of the Victorian night contained multitudes, as we've been discovering together throughout this journey: the gaslight and the danger, the servants below stairs, the seance table, the street outside, the woman at her writing desk after midnight. And there was one more dimension of the Victorian night that we haven't yet entered, one that takes us into territory even more intimate than any we've visited so far. Because the Victorian relationship with death was conducted largely after dark, in the private rooms of private homes. And what Victorians did in those hours with their dead, and what they feared might be done with them, was strange and moving, and in at least one case, genuinely horrifying in a way that has, Nothing to do with ghost stories. It has to do with the very real, very documented Victorian fear of being buried alive. Of all the fears that move through Victorian homes after dark, and we have visited quite a few of them now, there is one that stands apart from the rest. Not because it was the most common, not because it was the most rational, but because it was so specific, so visceral, and so thoroughly documented in the medical literature, the popular press, and the private correspondence of the era that you cannot dismiss it as mere superstition. The Victorians were genuinely, seriously, and in some cases obsessively afraid of being buried alive. And here is the thing that makes this more than just a morbid curiosity. They were not entirely wrong to be. The medical understanding of death in the Victorian era was, by modern standards, genuinely incomplete in ways that had real consequences. The tools available to a physician confirming a death in 1860 were a mirror held to the lips to check for breath, a finger on the wrist for a pulse and observation. No electroencephalogram, no electronic heart monitor, no precise neurological criteria for the absence of brain activity, just, to a doctor, a body, and his own senses, which could be and occasionally were mistaken. Conditions that we would now recognize and manage: severe hypothermia, certain drug overdoses, diabetic coma, catalepsy, a specific neurological condition that causes complete muscular rigidity while leaving the patient conscious, were in the Victorian era sometimes misidentified as death. The patient was cold, unresponsive, showed no visible signs of life. The death certificate was signed. The preparations began. How often this actually resulted in a person being buried while still alive is genuinely difficult to establish with precision, because by definition the cases that resulted in burial left no survivors to report them. But the cases that were caught in time, the body that moved while being prepared for burial, the sound from inside the coffin before it was lowered, were reported in Victorian newspapers with sufficient regularity that they became a fixed feature of the cultural landscape. The Lancet, which was then as now one of the most respected medical journals in the English-speaking world, ran articles on the subject throughout the mid and late Victorian period. The Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial, and, yes, this organization genuinely existed, founded in 1896, collected and published accounts of near misses, with sufficient documentation that they are still cited by medical historians today. Its membership included physicians, clergymen, and a significant number of people who had themselves been unconscious for extended periods and had presumably given the matter some personal thought. The fear ran so deep that it produced a remarkable flowering. Of invention, the safety coffin. A coffin designed to allow a prematurely buried person to signal for help was not a Victorian invention in the strict sense, with earlier versions appearing in the 18th century, but it reached its greatest elaboration and its widest cultural discussion in the Victorian era, when the anxiety around premature burial intersected with the Victorian love of mechanical ingenuity to produce designs of extraordinary, somewhat poignant complexity. The basic principle was consistent across dozens of different patented designs. A cord or tube would connect the interior of the coffin to the surface above, allowing the occupant to ring a bell, raise a flag, or release a signal of some kind if they regained consciousness after burial. Some designs included small windows of glass set into the coffin lid to allow light in and to permit observation from above. Some included air pipes. One particularly elaborate design, patented in the 1880s, incorporated a spring-loaded lid that the occupant could release from inside, combined with a ladder that would allow them to climb out of the grave unaided. The mere existence of these patents is extraordinary if you sit with it for a moment. Someone applied for a patent on a ladder inside a coffin. Someone else approved it. A market existed. These were not the products of a single eccentric inventor operating in isolation. They were responses to a genuine consumer demand from people who wanted, when their time came, a margin of error. Count Mitchell de Carnescarnecki, a Belgian nobleman who had reportedly witnessed the premature burial of a young girl in the 1890s, developed one of the most technically sophisticated designs and presented it to the French Academy of Science in 1897. His device used a glass ball placed on the chest of the body. Any movement, however slight, would trigger a mechanism that opened an air tube, raised a flag above the grave, and rang a bell. The Academy's response was measured rather than enthusiastic, but the device was manufactured and sold, and Carnescarnecki spent years promoting it across Europe with the missionary intensity of a man who had seen something he could not forget. But the safety coffin, for all its ingenuity, addressed only one part of the Victorian anxiety around death at night, because before the coffin came the watch, and the watch was something else. Entirely. The practice of watching over the dead sitting with the body of someone who had died through the night until burial was not a Victorian invention. It was ancient, present across cultures and centuries in various forms. But in Victorian England, it was practiced with a specific intensity and a specific domestic structure that made it one of the most intimate and least discussed aspects of Victorian nighttime life. When someone died in a Victorian household which, in an era of high mortality rates from tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, and childbirth complications, was not an uncommon event, the body remained in the home, not in a funeral home. The Victorian funeral industry, while growing throughout the latter half of the century, had not yet displaced the domestic management of death that had been standard for generations. The body was laid out in the bedroom or parlor, dressed and prepared by family members or a local woman who performed this service for the community, and then someone sat with it all night. The reasons were partly practical. In the era before reliable death certification, keeping watch was partly about confirming that death had actually occurred, that the stillness would not suddenly and terrifyingly resolve into movement. But they were also deeply social and spiritual. The dead were considered to require company in the transition from this world to whatever came next. Leaving a body alone in the night was regarded in many communities as a failure of respect, even a kind of spiritual abandonment. The watch was typically organized in shifts, with different family members or neighbors taking turns through the night. It was usually conducted in near silence or in the low murmur of prayer. Sometimes, particularly in working-class communities, it involved food and drink that served the practical purpose of sustaining the watchers through the long hours and the social purpose of marking the occasion as something the community shared. What I find most affecting about the Victorian Death Watch, when I read the first-hand accounts of people who participated in them, is the quality of attention it required. Sitting alone or nearly alone with a dead body in a room lit only by candles in the middle of the night for hours, this is not an experience that allows the mind to remain at the surface. The darkness and the silence and the presence of death created a specific kind of intimacy with mortality that Victorian people encountered regularly, and that we, in our era of professional death management and clinical settings, have almost entirely moved away from. The historian Philippe Aries, whose work on Western attitudes toward death remains foundational in the field, argued that one of the defining shifts of modern Western culture was the progressive removal of death from the domestic sphere, the gradual transfer of dying and death from the home to the hospital, from the family to professional strangedza process that accelerated through the 20th century and left us, he argued, more afraid of death rather than less, precisely because we had less experience of it. The Victorians, by contrast, had a great deal of experience of it. Death visited Victorian homes with a frequency that seems almost incomprehensible by modern standards. The average Victorian family lost at least one child. Tuberculosis alone killed roughly 1 in 4 people in England in the mid-19th century. Death was not an abstraction. It was a presence in the house, recurring, familiar in the most painful possible sense. And yet, this is the paradox that I keep returning to, all of that familiarity did not make the Victorian night less afraid of death. If anything, it made the fear more specific, more embodied, more focused on the precise, terrifying boundary between alive and not. Edgar Allan Poe, who was American rather than British, but was enormously popular in Victorian England, and whose work shaped the cultural imagination of the era in significant ways, returned to the theme of premature burial repeatedly in his writing. His story, The Premature Burial, published in 1844, catalogued real documented cases before launching into its fictional narrative with a calculated directness that tells you something about his audience. He didn't have to explain why this was frightening. He just had to describe it. The story was widely read in England throughout the Victorian period, and its cultural fingerprints are visible in the safety coffin industry, in the Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial, and in the private correspondence of people who wrote to their families with instructions about what should happen to their bodies, how long to wait before burial, what signs to look for, who should be trusted to make the final decision. Nation. These letters, when you read them, have a quality of contained terror that is both deeply historical and strangely recognizable. The specific fear that you might be aware and unable to communicate, that the people who love you might act in good faith and get it catastrophically wrong, that is a fear about the failure of connection, about the boundary where one person's knowledge of another person ends. It is, in other words, one of the oldest and most human fears there is, wearing the particular Victorian costume of medical uncertainty and mechanical ingenuity. There is one more piece of this story that deserves a moment of careful attention.
because it sits at the intersection of the Death Watch tradition, the Victorian nighttime household, and the question of grief that we touched on when discussing spiritualism. When Queen Victoria lost Prince Albert in December of 1861, she did not simply grieve in the conventional sense. She constructed around his death an elaborate physical memorial that persisted for the remaining 4 decades of her life. Albert's shaving water was brought to his dressing room every morning. His clothes were laid out each evening. His writing materials, LS, were refreshed on his desk. A cast of his hand was placed on her bedside table, and she slept with it within reach every night for 40 years. This was not madness. It was Victorian mourning practice taken to its most intense expression by a woman of enormous will and enormous grief. But it illustrates something important, that the Victorian relationship with the dead did not end at the moment of death. The dead remained present in the bedroom, in the rituals of the household, in the nighttime hours that had always been their most intimate territory. The watch over the body was the beginning of a process of accommodation with loss that the Victorian domestic culture actually structured quite carefully through elaborate mourning practices, through keepsakes and memorial photographs and locks of hair preserved in lockets, through all the material culture of Victorian death that we now find in museums and antique shops, and that seems, to our eyes, excessive or morbid. But it was not morbid in its intention. It was an attempt imperfect, sometimes heartbreaking, occasionally, frankly. Strange to manage an experience that doesn't become less terrible just because it's universal. The candle kept burning beside the body through the night. The person sitting in the chair who couldn't quite bring themselves to leave. The watch that was, at its core, just love that didn't know where else to go. We've now traveled through almost every room in the Victorian night. The parlor with its dangerous gas flames. The kitchen below stairs, warm with its secrets. The bedroom with its cold corners and its creatures and its chemical remedies. The drawing room where the seance table moved in the darkness. The street outside where a whole invisible city kept the visible one functioning. The woman's desk in the small hours. The room where someone was sitting with the dead. What we haven't yet asked is the question that ties all of these rooms together. What were all of these people, the nervous, the faithful, the medicated, the grieving, the inventive, the afraid, actually dealing with? What was the Victorian night doing to them collectively that they needed so many different strategies to survive it? And more importantly, what does any of this have to do with the children who were trying to fall asleep in the rooms directly above? Because the Victorian child's experience of the night, it was something else entirely, something shaped by darkness and discipline and stories told specifically to frighten, in a way that cast a very long shadow into the present. Let's go upstairs. Not to the master bedroom we've already visited with its cold corners and its chemical remedies and its locked door. Higher than that. Up the back staircase, past the landing where the gas light doesn't quite reach, to the floor where the ceilings are lower and the rooms are smaller and the wallpaper is a cheerful pattern of rabbits or rocking horses that looks considerably less cheerful by candlelight at 9 o'clock at night. This is the nursery, and the child lying in that iron-framed bed staring at the ceiling with eyes that absolutely refuse to close is living a nighttime experience so different from anything we provide for children today that it might as well be on another planet. We talk a lot about how Victorian adults experienced the night. We talk rather less about what it was like to be small and powerless and left alone in it. That oversight, I think, deserves correcting. The Victorian nursery was, by design and by philosophy, a world apart. In middle and upper-class Victorian houses, Eholds children lived on a separate floor from their parents, under the supervision of a nurse or a nanny, and the contact between parents and children was structured, limited, and conducted largely on the parents' terms. The novelist and social commentator Mrs. Humphrey Ward, writing in the 1880s, described the relationship between Victorian parents and their children as one of fond de care, distant affection, that expressed itself primarily in brief formal appearances rather than sustained daily intimacy. This was not neglect in the Victorian understanding. It was considered appropriate child-rearing. The separation of children's and adult spheres was a deliberate pedagogical choice, rooted in a set of beliefs about childhood that held broadly that children required structure, discipline, and moral instruction rather than the kind of emotionally close parenting we now consider essential. The nurse's job was to manage the children's physical needs. The governess's job, in households that could afford one, was to manage their intellectual development. The parent's job was to provide an intermittent moral example. What this meant in practice for the child in the nursery at night was that the person responsible for soothing a nightmare, for sitting beside a frightened child in the dark, was a hired woman who might be warm and devoted, or might be exhausted and indifferent, and who was, in either case, not the person the child most wanted.
The bedtime rituals in the Victorian nursery were structured around the same religious framework that governed the adult household, but applied with particular intensity to children, precisely because childhood was considered a period of special spiritual vulnerability. Evening prayers were not optional, not a suggestion, not something you did when you felt like it. They were the fixed, mandatory close of every child's day. And the prayers themselves were not the gentle "now, I lay me down to sleep" of popular imagination. Victorian children's prayers frequently dwelt on mortality, with a directness that we would now consider entirely inappropriate for a small person about to try to fall asleep in the dark. The prayer "now I lay me down to sleep," I pray the Lord my soul to keep if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take, which sounds stark enough to modern ears was, actually considered a gentle introduction to the subject. The religious educational literature of the Victorian era for children went considerably further, presenting death as a constant possibility and godly readiness for it as the appropriate response to each evening's darkness. The Reverend Isaac Watts, whose hymns and devotional works for children were reprinted throughout the Victorian period, wrote material for young readers that addressed the prospect of not waking from sleep with a car. Matter-of-factness that would send a modern child psychologist reaching for their notes. The intent was genuinely pastoral, to prepare children for a world where childhood death was common, so that neither the dying child nor the surviving siblings would be unprepared. But the effect for a 6-year-old lying in the dark after prayers must have been interesting, to put it gently. Now, here is the part that I find genuinely fascinating and that I think most people have never considered. The songs that Victorian children were sung to sleep with, the nursery rhymes, those seemingly innocent little verses that we still recite today, were in many cases carrying history so dark that knowing them changes how you hear the words entirely. Take Rye. NG Around the Rosie, the version that became standard in Victorian nurseries, collected and published by folklorist James Orchard Halliwell in 1842, is often claimed to reference the Great Plague of the 17th century, the ring of roses as a rash, the pocket full of posies as herbs carried to ward off infection, the falling down as death. The scholarly debate about whether this interpretation is historically accurate is genuine and unresolved. Some folklorists accept it. Others argue it is a retroactive reading applied to a simple game. But what is beyond dispute is that Victorian children were being sent to sleep with verses that at minimum described falling down together in a circle, which is not the most soothing image available. London Bridge is Falling Down contains, in its older versions, references to building a bridge on a foundation of a fair lady, an echo of the ancient practice of foundation sacrifice, the belief that a structure would stand only if a living person was buried within it. By the time Victorian children were singing it, that origin had been thoroughly forgotten, and the verse was simply a game. But the original darkness was still there in the words, carry, forward unconsciously across centuries. And then there is Oranges and Lemons, with its churches of London counting out debts and its bells of Old Bailey tolling, and that final line delivered with cheerful finality. Here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head. Children in Victorian nurseries played this as a game, the last two children caught under the clasped hands of their playmates, the chopper falling. The verse was old, its origins murky, possibly referencing executions at the Tower of London. But there it was in the nursery before bed, cheerfully sung by children who then went to lie in the dark and try to think about something else. I genuinely do not know whether Victorian children found this frightening in the way we might expect, or whether the repetition in the game context had simply drained the words of any remaining menace. But it does tell us something about how differently Victorian culture calibrated what was appropriate for children, a calibration shaped, as always, by the reality that death was not a stranger to Victorian childhood, and that pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of cruelty. Beyond the rhymes, there was the deliberate use of fear as a disciplinary tool in the Victorian nursery. And this is where the story takes a turn that is worth sitting with for a moment. The figure of the bogeyman by various names across different regional traditions. Spring-heeled Jack in the urban folklore of London and the industrial cities. Black Peter in the Germanic traditions that filtered into Victorian England. The unspecified dark figure would come for children who misbehaved was actively maintained by Victorian adults as a management strategy. This wasn't a guilty secret. It was discussed openly in household management literature, debated in the popular press, and defended on pragmatic grounds. Children who feared the dark were children who stayed in their beds. Children who believed that something unpleasant waited for those who disobeyed were children who more easily managed in the difficult evening hours, when tired adults needed them to be quiet and still. The child psychologist and reformer James Sully writing in the 1890s in one of the first serious academic treatments of childhood psychology in English, identified the deliberate cultivation of children's fears as one of the most counterproductive practices in Victorian child-rearing, producing not obedient children but anxious ones whose capacity for rational thought was undermined by a constant low-level terror that persisted well beyond childhood. His work was widely read and marked the beginning of a significant shift in how educated Victorians thought about the nursery. But the shift was slow. For most of the Victorian era, fear was simply one of the available tools, and it was used without much reflection. What strikes me as a historian looking at all of this is the paradox at the heart of Victorian childhood at night. On one hand, Victorian culture was genuinely sentimental about childhood in a way that was actually historically novel. The Romantic movement's idealization of the child as a being of special innocence and spiritual purity fed directly into Victorian domestic culture, producing an industry of children's illustration, children's literature, and children's products that was unprecedented in its scale and its tenderness. The paintings of children by artists like John Everett Millais rosy-cheeked, golden-haired, suffused with an almost painful sweetness represent one of the defining aesthetic products of the Victorian age. On the other hand, the actual lived experience of Victorian childhood after dark was, by the standards of that same sentimentality, rather at odds with the paintings. The separation from parents, the prayers about dying before morning, the nursery rhymes with their submerged shadows, the deliberate use of fear as a behavioral management strategy, the nurse who might be a saint or might be a stranger, depending entirely on the luck of the household. Robert Louis Stevenson, who was a child of the Victorian nursery himself, and whose childhood illnesses meant he spent many nights awake in the dark with his imagination for company, captured something of this quality in his collection of children's verse, published in 1885. The poems in that book describe a childhood that is outwardly cozy, the warm fire, the shadows on the wall, the toys arranged for play, but that is threaded through with a quality of solitude and strangeness that feels absolutely true to the experience of being a small person in a large, dark house in the middle of the night. His poem about the child whose shadow goes to bed before him, a small, apparently whimsical observation too. Actually a meditation on the alienness of one's own self in the dark, on the way that nighttime turns familiar things strange, on the specifically childhood experience of lying in the dark and not being sure whether the shapes on the walls are dangerous or not, and having no one close enough to ask. That experience, the dark room, the uncertain shapes, the awareness of being small in a large and not entirely friendly night, is one of the most universal things in human experience. The Victorian child lived it with less protection and less comfort than we now provide as a baseline. And the literature they were given, the prayers they were taught, the songs they were sung, all of it processed that experience in ways that were shaped by a culture that had a much higher tolerance for darkness, literal and metaphorical, than we do today. Which brings us, almost without intending it, to the question that has been waiting quietly at the back of this entire journey. We have now walked through the full Victorian night. We've seen what it cost, what it feared, what it built to manage the dark, what it passed on to its children, what it hid behind its closed doors and its green baize curtains and its lowered gas lamps. And the question that remains, the one that I think is genuinely worth asking, especially right now in our brightly lit, perpetually connected, sleep-disrupted modern world, is whether any of what we've learned changes how we think about our own nights. Because the story of the Victorian night isn't just history, it's a mirror. And what it reflects back at us is more interesting and more personal than you might expect. That is exactly where we're going next. Something has been present in the background of this entire story, drifting through every room we've visited, softening the edges of every gaslit street we've walked down, and we've never quite named it directly. It's the fog. Not the decorative, cinematic fog of period dramas artfully arranged around a lamppost for atmosphere. The real thing. The Victorian London fog was one of the most extraordinary and most destructive environmental phenomena in the history of any major city. And its relationship with the night was so intimate, so defining, that you cannot fully understand what darkness meant in Victorian England without understanding what it smelled like, what it tasted like, and what it did to the people who breathed it.
Because the fog didn't just obscure the Victorian night. In a very real sense, it created it. It thickened the darkness, amplified the danger, and pressed down on the city with a physical weight which shaped how Victorians thought, what they feared, how they wrote, and in ways that took decades to fully understand how long they lived. The specific character of Victorian London fog was not a natural phenomenon in the way that coastal sea fog or valley mist is natural. It was the product of a city burning coal on an almost incomprehensible scale.
By the middle of the 19th century, London's population had grown to somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, and the vast majority of them heated their homes, cooked their food, and powered their industries using coal. The city had roughly 300,000 domestic fireplaces, all burning simultaneously on cold days, plus the factories, the gasworks, the railway engines, the steamboats on the Thames. The smoke produced by all of this combustion had nowhere to go. On still days with low atmospheric pressure which, in London's climate, meant a significant proportion of autumn and winter days, it simply stayed. It accumulated. It mixed with natural moisture in the air and thickened into something that was no longer quite smoke and no longer quite fog, but was both simultaneously, in proportions that varied from merely unpleasant to genuinely lethal. The Victorians called it a pea souper, which is one of those nicknames that manages to be both affectionate and accurate. The colour and consistency of thick pea soup is actually a reasonable description of what the worst London fogs looked like from ground level. The novelist Charles Dickens, who was arguably London's most attentive observer across the middle decades of the century, described fog in Bleak House with an almost physical relish. Fog everywhere, up the river and down the river, into the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships. He was not exaggerating for literary effect. He was reporting. The intersection of fog and nightfall was where the Victorian atmospheric experience reached its most extreme. During daylight hours, even the worst fogs allowed some navigable visibility. Pedestrians could see a few feet ahead, could make out the shapes of buildings, and avoid the worst hazards. But once darkness fell and the gas lamps were lit, the fog did something peculiar to the light. Instead of simply blocking visibility, it diffused the gaslight into a sourceless yellow glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Landmarks disappeared.
Streets that a person had walked 1,000 times became
Easily recognizable. The sounds of the city hooves on cobblestones, the calls of street vendors, the distant bells of churches reached the ear in distorted, directionless waves that made navigation by sound as unreliable as navigation by sight. Contemporary accounts of moving through London during a bad November fog read like descriptions of a dreamscape. The journalist and social observer George Augustus Sala, writing in the 1850s and 1860s, described the experience of crossing Waterloo Bridge on a foggy night as being suspended in a yellow void, the bridge beneath his feet the only solid thing in a world that had otherwise dissolved. He could hear the river below but couldn't see it. He could hear traffic behind him but couldn't judge its distance. He felt, he wrote, as if the ordinary world had been temporarily suspended and he had been left to navigate its absence alone. That quality, the suspension of the normal, the dissolution of the familiar made fog, a uniquely powerful force in the Victorian cultural imagination. And its intersection with the night made it something that operated not just on the body but on the mind. The health consequences of Victorian London's air, and particularly why of its fog, were catastrophic in ways that the era only partially understood. Sulfur dioxide, carbon particles, nitrogen oxides, the products of burning cheap coal in millions of fireplaces, were present in the London atmosphere at concentrations we would now consider environmental emergencies. Respiratory illness was endemic. Chronic bronchitis was so prevalent that it was colloquially known as the English disease across Europe. The mortality statistics for London winters show clear spikes during periods of severe fog spikes that Victorian physicians noted and discussed without, for most of the century, having the analytical framework to fully explain. The connection between atmospheric pollution and excess death was made with increasing precision over the latter decades of the Victorian era. The medical statistician William Farr, whose work for the General Register, office from the 1840s onward, essentially invented the modern practice of epidemiology, was among the first to systematically correlate weather conditions with mortality data and demonstrate that fog events produced measurable increases in deaths from respiratory and cardiac causes. Farr's work was careful and meticulous. And, in the manner of genuinely important public health findings, largely ignored by the people with the power to act on it for several decades. The coal economy was too central, too profitable, too deeply woven into the fabric of Victorian life for the evidence of its harm to translate easily into policy. People continued to burn coal. The fog continued to thicken. The winters continued to be, for the old and the sick and the young, genuinely dangerous in ways that those above a certain income level could partially insulate themselves from, and those below could not. But here is the dimension of the Victorian fog that I find most fascinating and that gets least attention in the standard historical accounts. It was also beautiful. Not in a way that makes the harm acceptable, I want to be clear about that, but in a way that was genuinely recognized and genuinely responded to by some of the most perceptive visual artists of the era. The French Impressionist painter Claude Monet, who visited London repeatedly in the 1880s and 1890s and produced a series of paintings of the Thames and the Houses of Parliament in fog conditions, was explicit about what drew him there. He wrote to a fry, "And that London without fog would not be beautiful at all, that it was the fog that gave the city its magnificence." What Monet was responding to was something specific to the way Victorian London's coal-contaminated fog interacted with light. The sulfur particles suspended in the atmosphere acted as prisms, refracting light in ways that produced colors: deep yellows, burnt oranges, sudden violets in the evening sky that simply didn't exist in cleaner air. The extraordinary sunsets that Victorian Londoners described, the strange colors that appeared in the sky at certain times of year, were partly a product of atmospheric pollution, filtering the light in ways that painters found extraordinary and scientists, once they understood what they were looking at, found rather concerning. John Ruskin, the Victorian art critic whose influence on how the educated public understood visual beauty was enormous throughout the second half of the century, noticed the change in the sky and didn't like what he saw. He wrote in the 1870s about what he called the plague winter new quality of dirtiness in the atmosphere that he connected to industrial pollution, and which he described in terms that were simultaneously scientifically intuitive and apocalyptically anxious. Ruskin's Plague Wind essays, delivered as lectures at Oxford, are remarkable documents. A man of enormous aesthetic sensitivity registering in real time the degradation of the visual environment that had formed his imagination, and not quite being able to separate the aesthetic loss from a broader moral horror at what industrialization was doing to the world. He wasn't wrong. He was just early. The fog's relationship with crime in Victorian London is another dimension that deserves attention, because it was both practically significant and culturally enormous. Police constables walking their beats in fog conditions described a specific kind of professional helplessness. The inability to see more than a few feet in any direction, the way sounds were muffled and distorted, the impossibility of pursuing a suspect who simply had to step sideways into the yellow murk to disappear completely. The official crime statistics for London show patterns consistent with higher rates of opportunistic theft and street crime during foggy periods, though establishing causation precisely is difficult. What is easier to establish is fog's role in the Victorian cultural imagination of crime. The association of London fog with danger, with the lurking figure in the shadows, with the anonymity that darkness and murk together provided, was embedded in the popular literature of the era in ways that have outlasted the fog itself. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories set almost entirely in the London of the 1880s and 1890s, the same London that Booth was mapping and that Monet was painting returned to fog repeatedly as both a practical plot element and an atmospheric shorthand. The fog is where things happen that shouldn't be seen, where figures appear and disappear, where the ordinary rules of visibility and accountability are temporarily suspended. Robert Louis Stevenson set his novella about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in a London of gaslight and fog that was so precisely calibrated to its effect on the reader that the city itself becomes a kind of argument about what darkness social, moral, atmospheric permits. The fog in that story isn't decoration. It's a condition of possibility. Things that could not happen in clear daylight can happen in the fog, because the fog makes them invisible. And invisibility. In Victorian London was a form of immunity. There's a specific night in Victorian history that I want to linger on for a moment, because it crystallizes something essential about the fog's relationship with the city's vulnerability. In November of 1879, a fog event of unusual severity settled over London and stayed for several days. The records from this period, preserved in newspaper archives and in the journals of people who lived through it, describe conditions that were genuinely apocalyptic in their mundane horror. Street traffic came to a near standstill. The Thames ferries stopped running. Theatre performances were cancelled because audiences couldn't find their way home afterward. The General Post Office reported significant delays because mail carriers were lost in streets they had navigated for years. A physician named Henry de Bell, writing in The Lancet shortly afterward, estimated that excess mortality during severe London fog events deaths, above the normal expected rate for the time of year, was running at several hundred additional deaths per event, concentrated overwhelmingly among people with pre-existing respiratory and heart conditions, among the very old, and among children under 5. Several hundred additional deaths per fog event in a city that experienced multiple severe fog events every winter. These numbers are not the product of hindsight analysis. Victorian physicians were calculating them in real time, publishing them in medical journals, and the government was, broadly speaking, not responding at the speed that the evidence warranted. It would take until the catastrophic Great Smog of 1952, which killed somewhere between 4,000 and 12,000 Londoners in a single week, to finally produce the Clean Air Act of 1956 and begin the process of actually clearing London's air. The Victorian fog, in other words, was not a problem that Victorian society solved. It was a problem that Victorian society passed forward, generation after generation, until the 20th century finally paid the bill. And that, I think, is the aspect of the Victorian fog story that reaches most directly into the present, because the pattern, the awareness of harm, the reluctance to act, the prioritization of economic convenience over the evidence of suffering, the passing of consequences to people who hadn't yet been born, is not a pattern that ended with the Victorian era.
It's one we're still intimately familiar with.
When I read William Farr's careful mortality correlations, published in the 1850s, and then read the political responses to them, which were essentially variations on yes, but coal is important to the economy, I feel a recognition that has nothing to do with the 19th century. The specific substance has changed, the structure of the argument has not. The Victorian fog was many things simultaneously. A physical phenomenon, a health crisis, a source of beauty, a condition of crime, a shaper of literature and art and urban experience, a problem that was understood well before it was addressed. It was, in its way, a perfect metaphor for everything that made the Victorian night so extraordinary and so difficult. It obscured things. It transformed things.
It made familiar streets strange and strange streets dangerous. And it sat in the lungs of the people who breathed it, accumulating quietly the cost of a bargain that had seemed perfectly reasonable when it was first made. We're almost at the end of our journey through the Victorian night. We visited nearly every room, walked nearly every street, sat at nearly every table.
We've met the people who lived in these spaces, the servants and the seance-sitters, the night soil men and the newspaper readers, the children saying their prayers and the women writing in their diaries, and the physicians debating over their patients at 2 a.m. What remains is the question that all of this has been building toward, the one that makes this more than just a history lesson, the one that looks at everything we've discovered about how Victorians navigated the dark and asks quietly, seriously, and I think usefully, what any of it means for us. Because we think we've conquered the night. We think the electric light solved the problem. I want to suggest in our final chapter that the story is rather more complicated than that, and rather more personal. Here we are, the last room. And I think the right way to enter it is not with another dramatic scene or another historical revelation. We've had plenty of both. The right way to enter it is quietly the way you might sit down at the end of a long evening when the fire is burned low and there's nothing left to do except think about everything you've seen. We've spent a long time in the Victorian night together. V breathed its air, or tried not to, once we knew what was in it. We've navigated its darkness, listened to its sounds, understood its hierarchies and its fears and its remarkable, stubborn ingenuity in the face of everything it couldn't control. And now I want to ask the question that I think all of this has been quietly building toward. What did the Victorians know about the night that we've forgotten? And what did we gain when we turned on the lights? And what, if anything, did we lose? Let's start with a number that I find genuinely arresting every time I encounter it. In 1800, at the dawn of the era we've been exploring, the average person in the Western world slept approximately 9 to 10 hours per night. By 1900, the end of the Victorian period, that average had dropped to around 8 hours. By 2023, the American Sleep Foundation's data puts the average adult sleep duration in the United States at between 6 and 7 hours on weeknights, with a significant proportion of adults sleeping fewer than 6 hours regularly. 200 years.
3 hours of sleep gone. That is not a trivial change. Sleep researchers like Matthew Walker, whose work has done more than almost an
Joan Elses, to bring the science of sleep to public attention, described that reduction as one of the most consequential and least acknowledged public health shifts in modern history. The consequences of chronic sleep deprivation on cognitive function, on immune response, on cardiovascular health, on emotional regulation, on the risk of developing serious illness, these are now documented with a precision and a weight that is very difficult to dismiss. We solved the Victorian problem of the dark, and in doing so, we created a problem that the Victorians, for all their difficulties, did not have. The electric light bulb, which began entering domestic use in the 1880s and transformed the experience of evening life within a generation, did something to human biology that its inventors did not anticipate and that we are still fully reckoning with. The human body's sleep-wake cycle, what scientists call the circadian rhythm, is regulated primarily by light, specifically by the presence or absence of blue spectrum light, which the brain uses as its signal for whether it is day or night. Natural daylight is rich in blue spectrum light. Firelight, candlelight, and the early gas and oil lamps. The Victorian era were not they burned warm yellow-orange, the red end of the spectrum, which the brain's light-sensitive cells registered as something approaching sunset. Dim, warm. Time to begin winding down. Electric light, particularly the fluorescent and later the light-emitting diode lighting of the 20th and 21st centuries, floods the environment with blue spectrum light at whatever hour you choose to turn it on. Your brain, which evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to interpret blue light as it is daytime and should be alert, cannot distinguish between noon sunlight and a laptop screen at 11 at night. It responds the same way to both. It suppresses the production of melatonin, the hormone that initiates sleep and keeps you in a state of neurological alertness that your body had, for the entire previous history of our species, associated exclusively with daylight. The Victorian family sitting in their dimly lit drawing room at 9 in the evening, eyes adjusting to the warm glow of oil lamps, bodies already beginning the slow physiological descent towards sleep that would culminate in that first sleep that Roger Eckertz documented they were, without knowing. Get it, living in almost perfect alignment with their own biology. Their lighting was inadvertently appropriate. Their bodies were doing what bodies have always done when the light goes warm and low. We disrupted that with the best intentions in the world, and we are collectively living with the consequences. But I want to be careful here, because I don't want to romanticize the Victorian night in a way that erases everything we've spent the last several hours honestly examining. The Victorian night was cold. It was genuinely dangerous in multiple specific ways. It was lit by open flames that occasionally killed people. It was managed by medical practices that sometimes caused the very harm they were trying to prevent. It was inhabited by a class of workers, the servants, the night soil men. The street laborers whose experience of those hours was defined by exhaustion and invisibility rather than any kind of authentic connection with natural rhythm. A two-phase sleep pattern that pre-industrial people lived was not, for the majority of them, a spiritual practice. It was simply the reality of nights that were long and cold and offered nothing to do at midnight except lie still and watch.
AIT for dawn. The nostalgia instinct, when it comes to historical periods, has a tendency to select the aspects that look appealing from the outside and quietly set aside the ones that don't. The candlelit Victorian parlor looks romantic from a distance. It looks considerably less romantic when you know about the mercuric chloride on the mattress upstairs and the morphine in the children's medicine cabinet. What I'm suggesting is not that we should go back. We can't, and we wouldn't if we could. And any argument that says we should is probably being made by someone who has access to modern dentistry and is not thinking the proposal fully through. What I'm suggesting is something more modest and more interesting than that. The Victorian night, at its most honest, was an encounter with limitation, with the things you could not control, with the darkness that fell regardless of your wishes, with the cold that came whether you were ready for it, with the vulnerability of the body in the hours when the mind could not stand guard over it. And the Victorians, in their various and sometimes extraordinary ways, had developed an entire culture for sitting with that limitation, for being not in it. The prayers were a form of acknowledgement that the night was beyond your control and that you were handing what you couldn't manage to something larger. The diary writing was a form of processing, making sense of the day's texture before releasing it. The death watch was a form of witness, refusing to let the most significant transitions happen without human presence. Even the seance, underneath its theatrical apparatus, was a form of wrecking, a refusal to accept that the limitations of the visible world were the only limits that mattered. These were not naive practices. They were, in their different ways, sophisticated responses to the same fundamental condition. The recognition that not everything can be managed, and that the attempt to manage everything comes with its own costs. The psychologist and researcher Brené Brown, whose work on vulnerability has reached an enormous popular audience over the past 2 decades, has argued that our relationship with discomfort is one of the defining challenges of modern life, that the same technologies and systems we've built to eliminate suffering have also inadvertently made it harder for us to tolerate the ordinary vulnerability. Hat is simply part of being alive. That we have become, in her phrase, the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in history. Partly as a consequence of our collective determination to make sure we never have to sit with discomfort longer than the time it takes to reach for a device.
She's talking about the 21st century, but the pattern she's describing has Victorian roots, because the trajectory that leads from Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup to the opioid crisis of the present day is not a straight line, but it is a line. The desire to make the difficult hours manageable through chemistry did not begin with us. The belief that the right compound, correctly administered, could smooth out the rough edges of human experience, that belief was already fully formed in the Victorian pharmacopoeia. We have simply applied it at greater scale, with more sophisticated molecules, and with consequences that are larger in proportion to our greater reach. What I find genuinely instructive about the Victorian approach to the night, when I strip away the parts that were simply wrong or harmful, and look at what remains is its relationship with darkness as a meaningful space rather than a problem to be solved. The Victorian night was long, and it was real. It asked things of people. It required them to be present with their own thoughts for hours at a time, without the option of filling that space with stimulation from elsewhere. It created conditions in which the prayers were necessary, the diary was necessary, the conversation around the kitchen table was necessary not as optional self-improvement activities, but as the actual content of the hours between dusk and dawn. That enforced interiority, the long Victorian evening with its limited light and its limited options and its consequent depth of reflection produced, among other things, some of the most extraordinary literature in the English language. Dickens, Eliot, Hardy, Trollope, the Brontes, Collins, these writers were not working in spite of their era's constraints. They were working, in part, because of them. The long evenings that couldn't be filled with anything else made them readers, and readers became writers, and the darkness was the condition in which those particular minds had the silence they needed to develop. I'm not saying we need to give up electricity and sit in the dark to produce goo. D-work. Please keep the lights on. But I am saying that there is something worth considering in the question of what we do with our own long hours. What fills them, whether the filling is always serving us. There is one final image from the Victorian night that I want to leave you with, because I think it contains something that doesn't need much interpretation. In the winter of 1888, the same autumn that London was gripped by the fear and horror of the Whitechapel murders. The same winter that Manet was capturing the fog on the Thames, a young woman named Beatrice Potter, who would later become the social researcher Beatrice Webb and one of the most influential figures in the history of British social policy, was working on Charles Booth's poverty survey. She spent her evenings in the East End, in the streets we discussed when we talked about the night economy, talking to the people who lived there and writing up her notes late at night in the room she had taken near the docks. She wrote in her diary about those evenings with a quality of attention that still feels remarkable. The cold, the darkness, the faces she had seen, the gap between the London she had grown up in and the Lond, on she was looking at now, and she wrote about what she was going to do about it, not with grand rhetoric, but with a steady, practical conviction that slowly, imperfectly, through a combination of evidence and argument and sheer persistence, things could be made better. She was 29 years old, writing by candlelight in a rented room in one of the poorest parts of the richest city in the world, and she was deciding to spend her life trying to fix what was broken. That particular kind of clarity, the clarity that comes from sitting in the dark with the actual reality of things, without the option of scrolling away from it, is something the Victorian night generated again and again in the people who were paying attention. It generated Booth's poverty maps and Nightingale's nursing reforms and Edwin Chadwick's sanitation reports and the Married Women's Property Acts and the slow, grinding, costly progress of a society confronting what it would rather not see about itself. The dark didn't make those things happen. The people made them happen. But the dark gave them the hours and the stillness and the enforced honesty of the long, watch the conditions in which that kind of seeing becomes possible. So here is what I take from all of this, and what I hope you might take too. The Victorian night was harder than ours, colder, darker, more dangerous, less forgiving. The people who lived in it had less control over their circumstances than we do, and more experience of sitting with what they couldn't control. We have more light than they ever dreamed of, more warmth, more safety, more options, more tools for managing the difficult hours, for filling the silence, for softening the edges of the night. What we have less of, perhaps, is the habit of being present in the dark, of letting the hours after midnight be what they actually are, quiet and slow and a little uncertain, rather than another extension of the stimulated, productive, performed day. The Victorian evening prayer, at its best, was an act of honest accounting. This is what happened, this is what I'm afraid of, this is what I'm grateful for, this is what I'm going to release, because I cannot hold it through the night and function in the morning. You don't have to believe what the Victorians believed to find something useful in that practice. You just have to be willing to sit in the dark for a moment and let the day.
Settle before you try to sleep. The candle is going out now, the house is quiet. And wherever you're listening to this, whether it's late and you're already half asleep, or whether you've been with me through this whole long journey, and you're just now arriving at the end, I hope,
The Victorian night has given you something worth thinking about in those quiet minutes before the dark takes over. Good night, sweet dreams.